Yeah. We'll recapitulate. Unfortunately, I missed last week because
No,
I
the
got
week before.
yeah, I got no sleep that week. But here we go.
I hope
Mythostoricus.
everything's okay, Rick.
Yeah, I just have nights where from time to time my brain decides to wake me up at 2 in the morning and be absolutely futile. So Cornford's book Thucydides Mythostoricus, he's Cornford is making the argument that the reason that from our perspective Thucydides doesn't explain the causes of the Peloponnesian War, even though he says at the outset that's what he's going to do, and he seems to be satisfied that he's done it, but when we read it we go, I don't see any causes for the Peloponnesian War. How could somebody who's so clear about his intentions and his approach miss the mark so widely? And Cornford's argument is he didn't. His concept of causes is completely alien to our concept of causes. And in this, there's a very Kenneth Smithian kind of opportunity to look at the difference between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. And Cornford explains how what we want to read about is, the political economy of Greece and who were the different factions, and how did the struggle between them lead to somebody rising to dominance and pushing Athens into a war. That's the sort of explanation we want to see because that's how we explain history. But as he argues persuasively, Cornford's, Thucydides is basically inventing the discipline of history among the Greeks, and he doesn't know how to do it. The things that existed before that we could call history really aren't. They're more like sagas, like the Icelandic sagas. They don't we wouldn't call them histories, even though they superficially look like that. And so he's got to go somewhere else to look for his examples of how do you explain behavior. And where he goes is Aeschylus, right? Because Aeschylus is writing play after play after play that's going through the Homeric epics, which the Greeks understand to be their own past, and is trying to explain why things came out the way they did. And so, Cornford argues that Thucydides might not even be doing it consciously, but at any rate, he builds on this Aeschylean template to explain Athens's behavior in the Peloponnesian War as basically being a result of Athens's character. That is to say, just like an individual's behavior to the Greeks is explained by the nature of their character, in the same way, a polis like Athens, their behavior would be explained by their character. And in Aeschylus, the explanation of the protagonist's character comes out step by step in the unfolding of the tragedy. They say things and do things that are unexpected, and in so doing they reveal the hidden parts of themselves for the audience to see and to learn from. And so Cornford shows how Thucydides is picking and choosing incidents from the Peloponnesian War, and we know he's doing it because other people also wrote about the Peloponnesian War and included things that Thucydides left out, which is very interesting considering Thucydides' stated goals. So what we see is that he's massaging the evidence in order to make it fit an Aeschylean tragedy. And in doing so, he's also explaining, or he's taking for granted, but with Cornford's help, unpacking it, he's explaining, Thucydides is explaining how the Greeks believed human character works. What is the structure of human character? When does it lead us into tragedy? And if it does, why does it lead us into tragedy? And more importantly, the Greeks didn't have tragedy as this, like, every unfortunate thing is a tragedy, vague arm wavy concept. They had a very specific diagnostic analysis of tragedy in the same way that a modern medical professional can diagnose the stages of a disease. And they were very precise about it. And so, what we've been doing, what we did last time, 2 weeks ago, is we started the process of introducing the core concepts that Thucydides and Cornford are using to explain Aeschylus's concept, and therefore the ancient Greek concept of psychology, behavior, why do we do the things we do, how does tragedy unfold, because it's very interesting. This is stuff that most writers on the ancient Greeks don't touch with a 10-foot pole. They
Mm.
just like they somehow they look at it and they completely miss it, even though it's the core focus of the Greeks. It's that kind of problem where the thing, when everybody takes something for granted because they all agree on it, they often fail to explain it, because who would you explain it to, right? Everybody around you also understands it and agrees. You've all moved on from that point. So when the Greeks start writing stuff down, they don't say, by the way, people, 2,500 years from now, here's some things you should know about how we all see the world. They just leave that part out. And so Cornford is trying to use Thucydides to help reconstruct it. So what I'll do at the beginning is I'll briefly recapitulate the terms that we went through last time, and then pause for questions so we can talk about it and discuss it. And then from there, we'll move forward into the stuff we haven't got into yet. I include this paragraph 1 here because the turning point, from this is paragraph 1 of Kenneth Smith's book, Ancient Civilizations. It's that final couple of sentences when he says, only Aristoi appreciate the import of the Greek virtue that equates wisdom with moderation. Sophrosune. That's one of the magic words of the Greeks that moderns can't understand. If you look at the Wikipedia article on Sophrosune, it's really vague and arm wavy and self-contradictory. And it does that kind of survey of what did people over, 2,000 years of history, what did they think Sophrosune meant? And the result is a blur. It's like a committee vote full of compromise and self-contradiction. The modern attempts to understand Sophrosune don't make any sense. And they don't make any sense because they're appealing to something that's very central to the ancient worldview, but is completely alien and missing from the modern view. And so we don't have a way to express it. The English language doesn't have words for this. And our thinking can't do anything with this. So there's a reason why we all, and the same was true in the medieval worldview, by the way, and even in the Roman worldview. By the time you get to the corrupt late ancient period, Romans like Cicero, who care a great deal about the Greek worldview and are trying to document it, Cicero completely blunders in his work on virtues when he tries to define Sophrosune. He offers 4 possible Roman virtues that it might correspond with, and he wrestles a bit with trying to figure out which one might Aristotle have meant, for example, or Plato. And in the end, he picks one and says, well, it must be that. And for 2,000 years after that, that's what everybody said Sophrosune is defined as. I mean, after all, Cicero said it. That must be what the Greeks meant. But he wasn't a Greek. He didn't know what the Greeks meant. His worldview was already alien to the classical ancient worldview. He couldn't understand his own forebears. So this thing needs to be unpacked. That's why we're taking a couple of weeks to dig into this, because it goes right to the heart of what mattered to the ancient Greeks. So let's start with where we left off last time. Last time we were talking about the idea of the tragic passions. The tragic passions. I'm even going to write that phrase in the text because it's critically important. Cornford has an entire chapter called The Tragic Passions in his book Thucydides Mythhistoricus, and he refers back to it over and over and over throughout the course of the book. And the idea is that human beings, by passions, the ancient Greeks didn't just mean feelings. We weren't just talking about appetites or feelings or all those things that are supposed to be bad. They were talking about a very specific ancient Greek concept, which is that Homo sapiens is liable to a state of possession. Not possession by demons like the Christian or ancient Jewish idea, but possession by daimons, which are an entirely different thing. They're a passion. They're a kind of minor god. So let's start putting out the vocabulary that's associated with that. We started out last time with a quote from poet W.H. Auden. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. This is from a eulogy he wrote for a friend of his who committed suicide. And he's talking about the way that human beings think that they're in control of their lives, and yet there are enormous powers at work in the decision-making that people make that they themselves don't understand. They might make up explanations after the fact to say, why did I do this? But those explanations are often false. They're often explanations that please us to think about ourselves, but they don't accurately describe why we did the things we do. So without getting too specific, Auden just sort of waves his arm in the direction of a really core ancient Greek idea, which is this idea that it's not that we're puppets strictly, it's that we're caught between agency and contingency. And some of the time we're acting according to our will and our plans and our ideas. And some of the time we're acting according to things that possess us. The classic example I gave 2 weeks ago was from my own life. I'm an alcoholic by birth. Every adult member of my family, going back 3 generations on both sides, were practicing alcoholics who spent years in the bottle. So I lucked out in that I had all these bad examples. I never took up drinking because I could see for myself what the outcome was going to be. I understand that there's a power in me that's just waiting for the bottle to be uncorked. And it knows what to do with me when the time comes. And, the rest of the adult members of my family never got the experience that was needed to ward them off and to be cautious or guarded. It's a term we're going to come back to, guarded against this passion that exists within my genetic code. My wife doesn't have it. She could have a glass of wine and she's perfectly satisfied and done. But the people who have my gene don't want one glass of wine; they want all the glasses of wine. That's what defines alcoholism. This thing is more powerful than we are, and it possesses us unless we're on guard against it. The Greeks believe that's the normal condition of Homo sapiens. There's something about human nature such that it's not just alcohol, but a huge pantheon of possible tragic passions are capable of possessing us. And by capable of possessing us, what we mean is human character is hungry for that feeling of being alive and confident in the world. And that appetite for certainty and confidence and vitality causes us to willfully embrace, consciously or unconsciously, willfully embrace these great possessing passions that cause our behavior to miss the mark, to go out of true. And so we're gonna talk through what some of the core concepts are that they have associated with this. But the first one that we're going to start with, and I'll call on people's hands in a moment, is this concept of a daimon. A daimon. And famously, Heraclitus wrote about daimons. Ethos anthropoi daimon. Ethos anthropoi daimon. And it gets translated as character as fate. But what it actually means is the character of a person or a people or our species as a whole is like a god over us. It has authority over us. It shapes us whether we like it or not. It's like if you're a seafaring Greek whose livelihood depends on trade across the Mediterranean Sea, Poseidon is a god over you, because what the Mediterranean Sea decides to do from one day to the next is going to determine the success of your ventures. You can have all the willfulness and planning in the world, but that doesn't stop a typhoon from coming up and sinking your ship. There are powers greater than we are that have authority over us, and our job as ancient Greeks is to catalog those sources of authority in nature and to be on guard against them, to try to live a life in harmony with them. If we do that, we might succeed. If we don't do that, we're likely to end up in a tragic failure. So what Heraclitus is saying is that our own character, our inner nature, not just our shared nature as human beings, but even our individual natures, Phil's character, Stephen's character, Donald's character, my character, is like a personal God over us when it comes to the level of authority it has over our behavior and the outcomes of our plans and attempts to act in the world. And that therefore we need to understand it, because if we don't understand it, we're going to be blind to the consequences of the structure of our character. So this is what we mean by daimon. It's a suke or a psyche. It's like a mind, but it's a sacred suke. That is to say, it's not mortal. It's immortal in the sense that it's bigger than we are, it's more powerful than we are, and it has authority over us. And we better be on our guard against what it's going to nudge us to do. This is the core concept. So let's go to questions before we go on. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking of modern psychology. Of course, presumably started with Freud, but we knew what happened before that, but nonetheless, Freud cut the whole thing. But it almost seems like the Greeks were more advanced in the psychological makeup. Because with Freud, it's the unconscious. We're not even aware of it until it reaches the pre-conscious state. The Greeks already understand that it was at least semi-conscious, in other words, much closer to the surface than Freud would have it. And in some sense, so they're already constraining themselves to a certain degree where we just we have no idea what's happening. We got to go to a psychiatrist. And he or she that doesn't really understand either. So, so you have endless talks for years to, to, wedge it out. So, in some sense, they are more conscious of themselves, the intrinsic nature of who we are than modern day people. And even though we credit to Freud, they were way past Freud already. So that's very, very interesting. In other words, they understand the intrinsic nature of being as well as the extrinsic part. And so therefore it becomes a very interesting interplay between the intrinsic and extrinsic. And they were very aware of that. And even though it's done through storytelling or literature or whatever.
Right.
So Shakespeare certainly had a lot of that tradition, right? In other words, if you look at Shakespeare, like how could Freud take the credit, you know? Like Shakespeare was way before him, even if you don't go back to the Greeks. So yeah, that's very interesting to say how they are so aware of that, and we in a sense have lost it, and so no, so we I don't know what covered it over. I mean, was it was it Hegel that covered it over? I don't know. I'll have to think about that. That's it. Very interesting.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, it's there is a lineage of psychological within the science of psychology. There's a lineage that goes all the way back to the Greeks, and Freud admits in one of his books that he's basically borrowing most of his ideas about the human psyche from Shakespeare. He's got a whole essay in which he talks about Shakespeare and the things that he learned from him. Shakespeare, meanwhile, is busy keeping alive an ancient tradition of theater that goes back to the sacred plays of Dionysus. He knows exactly what he's doing when he writes a character to go up on the stage. He's the heir of Aeschylus. He knows Aeschylus's works, and he knows that he's attempting to use the action on the stage to anatomize the character of the human beings being represented there. In fact, that word character is directly related to the inner character of a human being. The whole purpose of the stage is to expose the invisible part of a person and lay them bare for an audience to learn from by saying, oh my God, Agamemnon did that? I don't want to do that. I don't want to be Agamemnon.
So could you answer this question? I've read uh, some Aeschylus, and then of course Sophocles, and then Euripides. Uh, it seems like I've always loved Sophocles more, but the way you put it almost seems that Sophocles was already falling into trouble in this sense, even though I think his plays are deeper, because with Aeschylus, he was confronting this in in a much more open way. And by the time Sophocles come from, it was pushed to fate much more. In other words, like uh you already lost control. You know, I mean, like, forget about Sophocles. I mean, Aeschylus. I mean, we're no longer in control, and it's got much more intense. I don't know whether he's just sort of emphasizing that aspect. You know, we have already lost Aeschylus, and we're in a lot of trouble, or whether he's just think that in some sense we're going backwards in the sense to to the Mycenaeans, in which we're motivated by that. We're out of control. That's why we started a war. And so he's repeating that as like we're already out of balance. So
Yeah,
that's kind of interesting how
yeah,
how that works. So in some sense, I don't know whether he's more psychological or less, but he's certainly much more, you know, the victim. We're the victim of things that we have no control over, in a
yeah,
sense.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, Thucydides Mythhistoricus, but also Cornford's other early book, From Religion to Philosophy, which was the one I read first. He's really exploring what Kenneth Smith describes in his book as the Greek transition from mythos culture to logos culture. And Kenneth describes some general principles and ideas about that. Cornford goes into specifics and says, what are the stages of the development of the Greek religion? Likewise, Gilbert Murray's Five Stages of Greek Religion. Remember Murray and Cornford were both disciples of Jane Harrison, and they're together. The three of them are working on this new anthropology-centered concept of the Greeks. And in it, they're seeing some of what you're talking about being revealed in the course of the tragic plays, from the earliest plays to the latest plays. You can see the shift into the logos culture continuing. And Cornford even makes the argument that by the time of the Peloponnesian War, many Greeks were semi-atheistic. They didn't really fully believe anymore in their own gods. And that part of the process of writing tragic plays was trying to squeeze deeper meanings out of myths that were starting to not hold the same authoritative, compelling meaning anymore for Greek society. And certainly when he describes the Piraeus, the part of Athens that's the voting bloc populated by non-Athenians who've been invited to the city, and they come from all over the Mediterranean, and they're focused on trade and money and crafts. Part of what's happening is that they never believed in the core Greek religion, right? They're just sort of going through the motions in order to get along with the city state that's supplying them with their revenue through the Delian League. And so there is a level of disbelief masqueraded, that's being covered up or masked as belief, going through the motions. There's a certain amount of hypocrisy and so on that's spreading. And even without the hypocrisy side, Cornford says you can see how Sophocles feels that he needs to write a more naturalistic explanation of events in his tragedies than Aeschylus does in his. Aeschylus is a more religious tragedian than Sophocles is. Sophocles is a more psychological tragedian, trying to describe more about circumstances and character and less about the role of the gods. And Cornford's argument is that Aeschylus stands with a foot in both worlds. It's half naturalistic and half a sacred play. And so it's what makes him so interesting, is that he's still showing the daimones that he believes are possessing people to cause them to do the crazy things that they do. And through that, he's revealing this deeper strata of Greek religion that predates the Olympian gods. Cornford argues that the Olympian gods are added on top of the older Greek religion, which is based on daimones. And the Greek gods are a small set of daimones that have sort of inflated, acquiring human character and more of what we think of as godlike qualities, but that people lost faith in that in classical Greece as they moved into a logos culture, but they retained the older attachment to the more psychological concept of daimonos and the way they possess people as still having validity long after they weren't sure that Zeus actually did this or Ares actually did that. So that's what you're seeing when you're comparing Sophocles and Aeschylus, is this transition in what are we still willing to believe in today. It's interesting. GP, come off mute. Welcome to the call and tell us what's on your mind.
Am I unmuted? Hi.
Yeah, you're good. Hi.
Cool. Hi, GP. John Paul. Happy to join the chat, and first time with the philosophy circuit. A lot of topics have been discussed, and because I'm new to this ongoing series, just wanted to host has asked you to start your video. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. I was on driving mode. Sorry, that was first time using the app on my phone. Okay. Okay, video's good. All right. And I'm unmuted. All right, cool. Hi, hey, hey. um, so this is an ongoing series talking about specific Greek intellectuals as to how they moved from mythos to logos in terms of forming the first inklings of a discipline towards historiography or something along that line. And we're trying to use the nebulous concept in modern times for Saffracine, and by deconstructing that higher level categorical word, we can have a better understanding of how these intellectuals from Greek times were able to record and identify tragedy. Is that the gist of our meeting today?
That's a great question. Let me
No.
let me address directly what you're asking about, and see if I can introduce the topic, because
I'm just
what I did
trying to get
today,
to
which
this to the stem. I'm just trying to get to like the root, or like the
exactly
yeah, because this is an ongoing series, and I'm like, okay, we've talked about like 8 different topics and like 2 different
yes
people.
yes. So let me introduce it for you. I'll take a few minutes
Cool.
here and introduce the subject. That's a great
Cool.
question. Thank you for bringing that up. We have a couple other new folks on the line, and I really should have backed up and done the intro.
No worries.
So
No.
let me
We're just
do that now.
several weeks in, so it's not a big deal.
Yeah. So this is week 105 in
Okay,
a
well,
series called Millennia and Microcosm. That's the name of this series, and it's named after a book that's going to be coming out by philosopher Kenneth Smith. Um, he's a living philosopher. He lives in Austin, Texas. Some of us are friends with him, and he wrote the book hasn't been published yet, but the installments have. He wrote it as a column in the back of a magazine around the year 2000, and the premise of the book is this: our ability to perceive the world and understand it is heavily shaped by the worldview of our epoch. There are these epochs in history, and during an epoch, even different cultures tend to share a common worldview without knowing that they do. It's something. It's like an
collective
invisible set of constraints.
you would say like it's collective notions of self that due to like fish and water not being able to recognize water, that
just like that.
collective notion of self eventually, if not externalized and articulated, gets forgotten and assumed. And
Exactly.
then there's the conditional, there's a constraint on the full awareness of all conditions.
That's exactly right. So what he does in this book is, in order to help moderns come to externalize and then study and learn to critique our own worldview, it helps if we look at 2 alternative worldviews. And if we look at them not to try to misunderstand them the way a modern would typically misunderstand them, but to try to say, if we set aside modernity, in their own rights, how did the ancients think of themselves? And then after that, we'll turn to, how did the medievals think of themselves and their world? And once we get that ability to sort of temporarily put on their point of view, now we can go back to the moderns, armed with those 2 alternative points of view, and say, not just what does a modern think of a modern, but what would an ancient think of a modern, and what would a medieval think of a modern? And the goal of this is to create some actual freedom for ourselves, so that we can pick and choose which assumptions we agree with now that they're visible to us. Which ones do we want to keep, and which ones do we want to maybe question? And that's a level of freedom that's not available to us as long as our own worldview remains invisible to us and assumed, because it's the water we swim in.
Okay. And so then to zoom into more what we were talking about today, now that I have that higher level understanding, you were mentioning specific Greek intellectuals. Now that we're zoomed in not into the medieval or into the contemporary period, but now into the ancient Greek period.
That's right.
And the notions of the spirits or daimons or demons, the spiritual supernatural view to the world that is overlaid a more base day-to-day or quotidian sense of the world, and how through mythos and song, that saga perspective to history transition to logos, to spoken without song, to recorded on paper into a two-dimensional form versus the full 4D or higher dimensional sort of full
Yes.
capturing of that universal experience in that shared moment. And so
Yes.
that transition is the first steps of history, but also the slow degradation of a more spiritual and collective notion of self to viewing, perceiving, and being one with history.
Yes. Yes.
And so while I forget, it was a Phil or Phil was talking about Shakespeare and bringing up medieval recordings of Shakespeare's plays and how the characters are like similar in the daimon aspect or the spiritual aspect of trying to cover like core parts of the human condition or the human psyche in regards to emotions and the usual narratives that would get towards understanding betrayal across sagas and epics and ways of perceiving, recording, and playing with history. And so that is where we're currently at. And and then we're supposed to now define Saffracine to figure out what that is, either in a more base natural sense of the word or in a more supernatural spirited form of that big word. Is that the idea?
Yes. Yes. In
Okay.
effect, we're in chapter 4 of this book. The previous 3 chapters are sort of introductory chapters. Chapter
Okay.
4 is the author Kenneth Smith had taught the ancient worldview and ancient philosophy so many times that he has the ability to compress everything he wants to say about it into one chapter. But the result is it's very dense reading. And
Yeah, the burden of expertise.
Yes,
the burden
exactly.
of expertise. Yeah.
So these words are all loaded with enormous meaning that the only way to find them is to really go slowly through chapter 4 and unpack the core terms to say what is he actually saying when he says this sentence? What is that actually about?
Yeah.
And so for Sunni,
for the 2 readings for this chat, I read the first reading. So I got that sense of what seemed to be actually in tone a rather scathing account of contemporary modernity and the lack, the dearth, really just the tone was very harsh against us moderns and how we've lost some deeper instilled aspect of being and of historical awareness or perspective. Everything has become mollified into a artifice of normality that's banal, and it's like that's basically what he said ad nauseum for like 8 pages that I read. But
right. So what's interesting is, the ancient worldview was that people and societies should be criticized regularly. It's the normal part of life that you're supposed to be looking at your flaws, and you're supposed to accept that you and your city state, everything that you're all trying to do together, is full of flaws. It's your job to find them, to put them into consciousness and talk about them. Modernity believes our job is to celebrate modernity because, after all, everybody but us is primitive and we're modern, and it's great to be modern. We're the most scientific, we're the most objective, we have the most freedom. We praise ourselves relentlessly as moderns, and that's the normal tone of modernity. And it's because that's the tone. If we treat moderns the way that the ancient Greeks treated themselves, it sounds like we must hate moderns. How could we say all these negative things unless we were the enemies of modernity and we're trying to destroy it and hated it? But in fact, that's what the Greeks considered their duty towards the things you love, is that you're supposed to talk openly and honestly about its flaws. So this is one of those places where you can feel, even if it's not quite visible, you can feel the shockwave when you try to cross the lines between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. It feels harsh and condemning when that's not actually the way that the ancients meant it. They meant it as, of course, the things you care about, you want to try to make them right. You want to try to fix them. And that means you got to be able to talk openly about what's wrong with them. It's one of the reasons he starts with the ancient worldview in this book, not just because it comes chronologically first in Europe of these three, but because the ancient worldview invented hypocrisy in the sense that the earliest stages of the ancient worldview are weirdly open about the bad things that people did and wanted to do. There's a sequence in the Peloponnesian War when the Athenians are talking to the members of a city-state that they're besieging, and they're basically saying, if you don't surrender and do everything we want, we're going to murder you all, and we'll rape all the women and sell all the children into slavery, and that'll be terrible. And you don't want us to do that, so just surrender, and whatever we do to you will be far less than that. The moderns would never say, we're horrible people who are going to do horrible things to you. We always say, we are the champions of freedom and human rights, and we believe in love. And it's only the other guys who are bad and do all the horrible things, right? The modern tone is to extremize how good we are and how bad the other or the enemy is. Whereas meanwhile, in the Peloponnesian War, here are these Greeks saying, we're awful people going to do awful things. So there is a level of candidness you can find in ancient Greek accounts that you can't find in anything medieval or modern. Because by the time you shift into the medieval and modern, there's a desire to appear different than we are, to make ourselves look good. And we think anyone who doesn't cooperate with us in making us look good, they must be trying to hurt us. They must be our enemies. So this is why it comes across as scathing in the opening, is he's sort of doing to us what the ancient Greeks would do to themselves and each other, and it's shocking to us to hear ourselves talked about that way. We're not used to it. It's not if you read newspaper articles, about America, or if you listen to political speech during a presidential campaign, nobody would ever get elected president if they talked about America the way that the ancient Greeks talked about ancient Greece. They'd be like, what a negative guy. So he doesn't mean to destroy modernity, and he doesn't mean to say modernity is the worst.
And so you're using modernity in the widest, most comprehensive saga of history, as in from 1000 AD to the present moment, because that's really what modernity has been, is this slow progression. Like in the medieval times it was so slow, but the sense of the good Lord taking care of the serfs in a way that had to be with a nice externalized niceness, because there was something in terms of a grander collective that had to be managed and cared for, going back to little fiefdoms, and that eventually consolidated to what we know as more in historical modern, the few hundred years as the nation state. That was a continuation of that same cycle of fakeness, or selling the nice image and pandering to that optics versus the substance, the shadow versus the soul or spiritual core of whatever that collective unit is. So it sounds like modernity from 1000 AD to this present moment is how we're talking about modernity.
Yeah,
that inversion of optics to internal spiritual being, and that maybe that misalignment from how in the past everyone was more spiritually open and forthcoming in the nuts and bolts of next steps as a collective.
It's what's going to be interesting about doing this book. What we're basically trying to do is, at this point, we're trying not to settle questions about the medieval epoch or the modern epoch, even though he started with them in the intro. We're really just trying to zero in on what are the parts of the ancient worldview that are radically different than we think they are, and radically different than the equivalent things that a medieval or a modern would do. And so I just posted again in the chat there the link to chapter 4, which is the one that we're on. Chapter 4 is broken up into 8 lettered sections, and each of these lettered sections picks one core concept, or one or two sometimes in a dialectic, and tries to drill past our modern ideas about what that must mean to say, but what did the ancients think that it meant? And so they build on each other until finally we're in the last section, section H, and we're talking about how it collapsed, how the Athenian conception of the world fell apart during the Peloponnesian War and the years that followed until finally it was radically different than it had been. You know, the transition into a logos culture was more complete. So what we're doing today basically is, in order to help understand that, we're digging down hard into this concept of sophrosune. And we're digging into this concept because it goes to the heart of what the ancient Greeks thought human life was supposed to be about. And how would you know if you were succeeding at it, or how would you know if you were failing at it? And it's getting right into the moral imperatives about why people get together into societies and so on. And as a result, there's a lot of juice here to be extracted. And I'm just using Cornford's book, Thucydides Mythhistoricus, as an opportunity to reveal some of these ideas about sophrosune. So there's going to be a series of terms we're going to go through. There's going to be some exploration of how these things relate to each other, and gradually it will emerge, you know, what the Greeks thought sophrosune was. So I hope that answers your question of kind of where we are. And
It did. Thank you so much.
Thanks for raising the questions. They're great. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, I was watching one of David's film sessions, and we had a lighthouse, which I hadn't seen a few years ago when it first came out, and I didn't really, it was a bit too extreme for me, but this is demonstrating this principle of the two guys get possessed by different gods. One gets possessed by Proteus and the other gets possessed by Prometheus. And this is a Jungian thing, isn't it? The idea that you can get possessed by your archetype or a archetype. And watching the film, actually, it did raise an issue with me as to the value of the personality, because the personality is the lid on the bottle that keeps the possessing entity within, you know, in a safe space, so to speak. You take the lid off, you take the mask away, you take away the persona, and the craziness just comes out in a pure form rather than being moderated by the real social situation that we're in. So, yeah, I wonder about what is the mask, what is the personality, and how does it deal with the possessing daimons is a bit of a question to me. When I think of it, I think of somebody like Karl Marx has been possessed by an archetype. Another thing, you know, when I think about the transition of human society, once the working classes and even what we'd term the lower middle class were poor people. The working class was in a really bad deal. And even people that possessed some property or something like that were struggling to make ends meet. I mean, really struggling. Not like what people are complaining about now. They're living on easy street compared to, say, people in the 19th century. Because the funny thing is, such a mass of humanity was originally so poverty-stricken, and then things improved, and everybody that bought a house on the corner block started to think they were the middle class, and they started to adopt airs that I'm so much better than all those losers. This is one of the, you know, currently this epoch of time, people will look down on other humans, you know, like you're homeless and that, and there's a justification for looking down on them. But the extreme to which they look down on other humans that have fallen by the way is curious. I've got the house on the corner block. I'm doing all the right things. I'm virtuous. Those other people, they're less than human. This people have been seized by this sort of this modern culture of wealth within the last 50 or 100 years, that so many people now adopt these airs. And I wonder, what are they being possessed by? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, these are telling points. And this goes to the core that Shakespeare, going back to Phil's comment, has in common with the ancient Greek concept. And that's that there is something protean in us. There's something in us that is capable of being more than we appear at the moment, that can shift and change and adapt. And so when Shakespeare says, all life's just, basically all the world's a stage and human beings are just actors on it, saying their lines and going through their things, that there's a level of artifice to the things that we take as authentic human life. We think he's being poetic. Oh, look, he's using a metaphor. But Shakespeare didn't think he was being poetic. He thought he was telling the literal truth. He's saying the thing that people don't want to admit to themselves is the extent to which the things they take for granted are not necessary. They could be other than they are. The ways that we behave, the things that we like, our preferences in music, our preferences in political parties, could be very different. There is a amorphousness almost to us. But protean is better. It's that we can take on different shapes, right? It's not actually shapeless. When we take on the shape, we throw ourselves into the role. And so Kenneth Smith likes to quote the famous Italian proverb that when the audience has seen a fantastic opera performance and they're all jumping up in their seats and cheering and clapping and saying, that's just the most amazing performance. Meanwhile, the people on the stage are going, oh no, we're the second best performers in this space. It's the audience that are the best performers, because we were just taking on a role for a little while, whereas you guys are performing the roles of your lives. And you're so committed to your roles, you actually think you are those people, which you're not. There is this sense of of theater and drama as not being fake, as not existing merely to make a buck or to become famous or to express yourself artistically. All the ways that we define theater in the modern world, there is a deeper sense that theater is something sacred and that it comes from the cult of Dionysus. And the purpose of theater is to reveal the extent to which how we behave is a role. And there are more possibilities to us that are hidden so long as we completely believe in the role and forget that we have other choices. You see this a lot with people who threaten other people and say, well, you're making me do this. I'm just a helpless pawn of fate. You're forcing me to kill you. Right? We've all seen villains say that sort of thing. And sometimes it happens in real life. And what's happening in it is something that Shakespeare's critiquing when he says that, which is, in fact, we have to take responsibility for the roles that we play. We can't just say, I'm a helpless pawn of fate and I had to do this, because you could have done something differently, depending on your character and depending on how guarded you are against your own inner impulses and the weaknesses of your character. The more you know about yourself, the greater your opportunities to shape yourself into something different and maybe better than what you are now. But as long as you just pretend that it just has to be this way, then you're going to miss half of what it means to be human, which is this weird malleability and this ability to persuade ourselves that our roles are real, even when they're not. All of this is caught up in this concept of a daimon, that when we throw ourselves into a role and believe it with all our hearts, we are possessed by that role. We believe it so hard that we forget that the believing was a choice or an act, and we think this is just our nature. Who are they're not denying that we have a nature, but they're saying the full range of possibilities of our nature is much broader than we think it is, because we don't know ourselves very well. Thus the ancient Greek idea, gnothi seauton. We have a duty to know ourselves because we don't. GP, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Taking on what Steve introduced about the mask of modernity and the economic trappings that create inequity, and that looking down upon others. I mean, that's, I think, existed as well in other aspects of societies and in other sagas and epics. I mean, like the caste system for India that's existed for thousands of years, and that notion of separateness and caste as well as class involved. So I think what we're remarking on is actually um, more common and insidiously found throughout all of human civilizations. Um, and um, I think that mask and what Rick, then you're saying in terms of that being a daemon or a demon, I think that we're all just using different words to describe ego of, and I'm taking ego in like the most like neutral and widest application of like self-image, and that when you externalize an image of yourself, I mean, that can be just kept still within your own head, but when you decide to be this mask, that choice, which we end up forgetting was always a choice, like that's a falsehood. That is forcing a separation from the divine source of being one with all being. It's like when you externalize so much at a certain point, you don't internalize anything. And there's something in which at your spiritual deepest of cores, like you've at some point burned the mask and you are being one with all and all in one. And so in a sense, that demon disappears and you're just frolicking like Bambi in the forest. So yeah. I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. Sorry.
No, it's I get it. It's thanks for.
It's like I
thanks for
feel like
bringing
we're dancing around like what is ultimately a spiritual conversation, and what we're lacking is spiritual words to get to the core, or the like, oh, what's lacking is, oh, the ancients didn't externalize spiritual aspects and collective notions of self, because that was the assumption of being.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the questions that you're raising in this comment are profound, and they can't be easily answered. You know, Nietzsche writes a lot about this. You know, he's very concerned with the way as moderns we've lost touch with our own vitality and innocence, that we're separated from the life force within us to such an extent that we sort of live these cramped, conventional, empty lives. And he wishes that we could be frolicking in the forest like Bambi. And the Greeks explore these ideas too. This is a big part of what we're going to be talking about today and next week
that,
and so on.
and that's my point. I think, yeah, and with the Italian proverb you introduced, like, oh, the performers who are doing the humanistic behavior of music making and taking part in what is a spiritual creative process of music, like they are more closer to God or a higher power or an external, like they are more in sync, in tune, in rhythm with their inherent being.
Yes.
And so by that, they're not actually performing. The performers are the audience. The musicians are just being, they're not even behaving. They are having fun with their being.
Yeah, they're working to become one with the music, to remove the ego and be entirely merged with the music.
Like, but they are the music. That's my point. It's like there's no like even the words themselves force a separation when at a certain point it's the words are reductive to the experience of being one with the waveform, the sound wave.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an alignment of purity between their internal core and what externalizes outward from them. And that is more one with the vibrations of being versus those behaving seated all in their cubicle boxes of the audience, knowing to clap when to clap without maybe having those vibrations touch their internal world of vibration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, GP.
Yeah.
Yeah, this and what you're saying, you know, it helps to illustrate the concept of the daimon well here, because, you know, the idea of a daimon, part of what separates it from the medieval concept of a demon is that the daimon is sacred. It's not some sort of evil being that is, that is warping you by possessing you. It's some aspect of the cosmos that's profound and important and authoritative. And when it possesses you, you become one with it. And you are, for example, they believe that there were different daimones of music. And, the people who are the most amazing performers of ancient Greek music, they believe were, they had become the music just in exactly the way you're saying. They were embodying it, and that's the state. I'm going to actually put the word in here. There's one of the 5 original pieces of terminology that we were adding is called entheos. Entheos. And it's the state of being possessed, of a mortal being possessed by a god or a daimon. And so, when you're describing the musician who is the waveform, and it's the music made manifest, that's exactly what the ancient Greeks mean by entheos, when the daimon of the music or the daimon of dance or some other daimon possesses you, it's not an arm's length possession like in The Exorcist where the demon possesses the girl. It's you actually become that thing. You become the expression of it in the world. Yourself and itself are now one for the duration of the entheos. And to the Greeks, this is a normal part of life. Life is supposed to involve this. And there's good parts of this and there's bad parts of this, which we'll get into. But the good parts are like you're saying, you have the ability, human beings have this ability to become one with really amazing things and to become, vessels for them. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Tired today. I'm getting this conversation just going way deeper than I can dive. But I wanted to say that I'm not sure that to understand what Kenneth is saying here as he's trying to sort of sum up the fall of classical Greece commits us to, we need to commit to some theory of the Peloponnesian War or not. That, this, what he's, to me, what Kenneth is pointing to, I'll turn Kenneth into a Platonist for a while. The polis is the soul writ large, which is another way of saying, contingency and agency. The polis is not a historical force. It's the consequence of a human force. And the Greek polis, whether it was changed, it changed at Athens and caused the war, or was changed as a result of the war, still the Athenian suke changed. I mean, we can see after it's different, and that's what he's talking about here. The rise of the Gnostic soul. He uses utilitarian, but it's good, instrumental. All those words that reason gets used as a tool, not to provide self-provenance to the human being or sophrosune, but to help it make money, manipulate people, whatever. And that's what we have to say, that things change because we change. And it's true, for some of us, things changing will change us. I mean, it's reciprocal, but the agency there lies somewhere in the people. That the people that guided Athens ceased being aristocratic, the aristoi, and became the Bonosoi. Now, did they cause the war? Did the Bonosoi cause the war that led to this change? Or did the war provide the opportunity for them to do it? Or were the Aristoi destroyed as a result of the war? I keep this whole thing about the people in the war. It reminded me of a very famous quote from he who shall not be mentioned, not Voldemort, but Adolf Hitler. If the Jews succeed in bringing war to Europe, they will certainly be destroyed as a consequence of that war. Is that what happened in Athens? Where if the Aristoi succeed in bringing war to the classical world, they'll certainly be destroyed. I can imagine some sophist saying that almost. This will be an opportunity for us to get rid of these people that have been suppressing us all along. Oh, well, I'm drifting off into nothingness. Oh, and entheos, I'm very enthusiastic about that word. I get enthused when I hear people say that word. We have a word like that. We just don't think that we get filled with the God. We just think we get full of ourselves.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I mean, it's Cornford's arguments about cause and effect is just a theory. We don't want to get too lost in it, but what's underlying it is the opportunity to look at how the Greeks imagined the structure of human personality worked. Where did our behavior come from? Why did things turn out the way that they do, whether for good or for ill? And there's a whole nexus of really interesting ideas that it is required to that's required to understand a term like sophrosune. I'm just sort of taking this opportunity because what Kenneth's pointing out here is that the failure that begins to happen with the rise of sophism and with the spread of corruption, from the ancient Greek perspective, it's a failure of character. It's that Athens will not be governed by people with sophrosune. It'll be governed by people who make practical decisions, like I want to be rich. I don't care what happens to anybody else. Here's my chance. It's like that character the Greeks believed is the cause. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah, the taking a week off allowed me to go get a copy of Thucydides' Myth Historicus, and I didn't read the whole. I read the first part, and it's certainly there that the agency, it's people's character, although Cornford does seem to criticize Thucydides a little bit because he's not aware of Marxism.
And
he doesn't say Marxism, but he says, well, there are social and economic forces that Thucydides just doesn't account for. But I became far more sympathetic to what Kenneth was saying and what Thucydides was saying, that Thucydides says, bullshit, Cornford. People are the source of agency, not mysterious economic or social forces. This is Archidemus and Pericles and how they didn't get it worked out.
Right.
Right.
And
you can take your economic forces and just go away. Take them with you. No, I think, there is somewhat that, well, Cornford sort of talks about modern historians, but what he means are I think that people that wrote about the great man theory of history, and that the postmodern, which he goes with, is the sort of historical forces. And you see there more Hegelian or Marxist theories of history.
Yes.
But I think what we have to do is, Kenneth is saying the people changed. their
Yes.
character changed,
Yes.
and their society collapsed.
Yes.
And we should think about that, because it's a different, it's one of those different perspectives,
It is.
we get so used to, well, maybe we're all not just caught up in these currents of history. I mean,
Right. Right.
maybe we should do something. All right, I'm
Maybe
going to
we
go
shouldn't
back.
be-
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't be pacified. Maybe we shouldn't be infantilized and trust the forces of history to solve all our problems for us. Maybe
Well,
people have to actually be active in the world to make
since
things
it's
better.
and that goes back to what we've talked here a little bit. Sharon was so good at bringing in Timothy Snyder and his stuff on tyranny, but his stuff on Eastern Europe,
Yes.
where he uses contingency and agency a lot, where he says part of the failure of Western civilization is that it actually believes in that, things like Obama used to say, that the arc of history bends towards justice. And he says, one, it doesn't bend anywhere because it doesn't even exist. And we've done great harm to the world civilization by believing in such claptrap instead of getting off our butts and doing stuff.
Yes. Well, see, and that's why the second half of the book is so interesting, because once he dispenses with his criticism of Thucydides for not being sufficiently modern, he spends the rest of the book showing what Thucydides believes instead. And in the course of that, he shows what Aeschylus believed. And between Aeschylus and Thucydides, you get a really good discussion of the structure of character, the way daimons operate in people, the structure of tragedy. It really just becomes one of the best depictions of the kind of Aeschylean model, and therefore the archaic or ancient Greek model of the understanding of history that I've ever read anywhere. Which is funny coming from a guy who starts out by saying, if only he knew Marx. It's like, yeah, well, but look how interesting this other stuff is that you're describing.
Yeah, I'll have to keep reading, but yeah, I just don't think, character changed. It changed the nation,
Yes.
the nature of Athens.
Yes.
There might be a flip side to that too. It was, to some extent, the Spartans were very conservative. They were the same at the end of the way, kind of.
Yes.
They certainly were not the most interesting at the beginning, but maybe they know. Well, they're like the hedgehog, I guess. They know one trick, but they know it well.
Yes. Yes. Athens' fall into corruption starts to make the Spartans look good. When the Spartans are saying things like, I know you just won a battle and you're full of yourselves and you think things are great, but remember how we're all supposed to be cautious in victory, magnanimous in victory, because we don't know if our luck will hold. And the Athenians are going, look, schmuck, we're the greatest in the world. We can conquer everything. And the Spartans are going, oh, God, you're making us look good. We were just trying to be cautious and conservative, but you're making us look like paragons of wisdom by comparison with this foolishness. And this is where it becomes really clear in the book. Thucydides really sees what you're seeing, what you're describing. He really sees it as a change in character in Athens, that people like Cleon, the what does he call him? The most violent of the Athenians rises to power and starts to have influence. And it, helps to change the character of the whole city state. They start thinking, sure, why shouldn't we be bullies? We've won so far. That means we'll win forever. We can't possibly suffer a reversal of fortune. That ancient Greek concept is passé. And they end up instead completely illustrating the ancient Greek concept of a reversal of fortune. I remember my history teacher I first read Thucydides in 1985 for a class on world history. Went from the cavemen to détente in 3 quarters. in 1 year, which was, let me say, a little dizzying experience. But each quarter, he would assign us some books to read. And for the ancient sequence, Thucydides was one of them. M.I. Finley's The Greeks was the other Greek book. And then the history of the Peloponnesian War was there. And I remember him saying, the course of the Peloponnesian War can be summed up in two incidents. How Sparta had a great land army and Athens had a great naval army. And at the beginning of the war, when the Spartans try to fight the Athenians on the sea, they're so incompetent that the Athenians defeat them by rowing round and round them in circles, in slightly smaller concentric circles each time around. And it caused the Spartans to unconsciously back up into each other. They were facing outward, and they backed up into each other until their oars tangled and they couldn't go anywhere. And then the Athenians just beat them. And you're like, see, this is the cleverness of the Athenians and the incompetence of the Spartans. He says the irony is late in the book, after things have reversed, the Spartans use that exact same trick on the sea against the Athenians. The Athenians fall for the exact same trick. If anybody should know this trick, it's the Athenians. And lo, how they've fallen from their position of splendor and advancement to fall for the very trick that they used against the Spartans. And he says that's in a nutshell the fall of Athens and the rise of Sparta over the course of the war. So, I mean, this book is the Peloponnesian Wars is incredibly useful for seeing into the minds of the ancient Greeks. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
What came to mind was your interaction with GP. I was trying to knit together those two comments that all the world is a stage by Shakespeare, as you put it, which is theater, and GP saying that music is the language of the soul, or something of that sort. I don't have that quite right, but and I want to say something that sort of like sparked my thought. When I went to college, I really fell in love with music. I actually like music more than I like art. But I gave it up simply because I was just incompetent in doing music. So I just became a listener, but a fairly deep listener. And this happened to me one time that kind of authenticate to a certain degree what GP said. I think I was still an undergraduate at UC. And one day I was listening to Brahms. I believe it was the Fourth Symphony, but I'm not sure. I had spent a lot of time to show you how much I love music. I spent a lot of time saving money. I had very little money. And it took me 2 years to save enough money to buy a fairly good record player. It was then $500 at that point, which is quite a lot of money then. Gave up a lot of meals. So I've been listening to music a lot. And I remember listening one time, I sort of fell semi-asleep when I was listening to Brahms, but I wasn't asleep. And I actually became one with the music. Once again, I don't want to say this happened to me all the time, but that one time was really shocking. I remember I was so much into the music that when the record got to the end, the arm didn't pick up, as my record player was. And it just sort of went, like this. And I was shocked. Like, what happened? Where am I? Who am I? It's like, it was shocking. I actually was the music. And it took me like a few seconds to realize, no, I was just listening to music. I wasn't the music. It was very, very interesting that that really gave me the idea that how deeply music could get in, penetrate into your spirit. And so that's that part. And I actually believe that, that this was a kind of language that was maybe pre-linguistic, but it really have something to do with your spirit in relation to existence. Then you mentioned about all the world as a stage. Right away, it threw me into like Plato's cave. I wonder why Shakespeare didn't build his stage underground so he could illustrate the cave itself, right? And it gives me another image. Of course, when you're in the cave, you're constrained by the structure of the situation in the cave, right? Which seems like part of existence, at least in a capitalist society, You just take on a role, you do your thing, I mean, it's like, and so, but it's interesting, the shadows, in some sense, are those shadows that Shakespeare casts on the screen? Because the shadows just didn't appear. There was a fire and back in which somebody was making shadows. Time's up. Yeah. I guess it's funny to me. And and in some sense, if the world is the stage and we are, in a sense, the the silent actors that was being puppets, was it Shakespeare that was making the shadows to let us know who we are? I mean, how does that translate into relationship in the cave of Plato, say, climb up the cave and see the sun? There's no Shakespeare here. Making the shot. How does all of that work? I mean, the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, like, that's an interesting situation. I just thought I would bring that up. So those stories, those occurrences, I guess Shakespeare had learned language rather than just listening to the sound of the heavens. Okay, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I think it's not a coincidence that the structure of the Globe Theater makes it look like a grotto. I mean, he constructed it as a big round encompassing space, much like a cave. I think it's also not a coincidence that Plato was so hostile in the Republic to artists. So maybe what Plato's after and what the sacred priests of Dionysus are after are opposites. Uh, and Plato thinks that you can see the truth by leaving the cave, and the priests of Dionysus and maybe Shakespeare think that when you're not in the cave, you think that you're seeing the truth, but you're not. That's where you see the shadows, and that somebody needs to help you through a sacred reenactment, live through an experience that will reveal to you parts of reality that are invisible otherwise, like the inner nature of character and how it works on us. Uh, I'm pretty much with GP on the idea that real music lovers, when they're fully immersed in the music, become the music and lose themselves. The act of listening goes beyond a passive reception and becomes an immersion in a union with it. Because the experience you described, I have many times with music, where I'm totally in it, and it's shocking when it ends. You sort of can't believe it's over. But
Well, I mean,
anyway,
this seems to go back to the debate about the unconscious and consciousness. I don't know whether Plato ever addressed that head on. I guess maybe he did sort of subliminally. illustrating the cave in a way. But it seems to me there might be a lot more in the unconscious that's part of our soul
Yeah.
that maybe Plato didn't acknowledge, that maybe the sun cannot totally reveal. So
Yeah.
I think there's a tension between the two,
Yeah.
rather than just a one-sided coin up. Plato was supposed to be a dialectician, but that's the dialectic between the unconscious and the consciousness. That's a very important part. All
Yeah.
right.
Thanks,
I'll-
Phil. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Donald has talked about is the way that, Kenneth Smith is often critical of Plato, but sometimes in ways that are responding more to a theoretical idea about Plato than the actual Plato. The actual Plato might not have been saying what the theory says Plato was saying. I run into this a lot with attempts to read the Greeks, where there are so many terms that just don't translate into English. And so when people force them into English, they end up having Plato and Aristotle and others. Bye, Marshall. Plato, Aristotle, and others, they end up having them say things that they would never have said. But that an English person role playing Plato or Aristotle might have said. We sort of project backwards what we think they should have meant. And the next thing Aristotle might be saying the opposite of what he actually said because of the terms that we've chosen to use for the translation. This is what I'm trying to get at with Sophros Sune today when we eventually get back to the text. But for now, let's keep going with Q&A and see where that takes us. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so make a little personal point in David Miller's group. 10 days ago, they were talking about failed prophecies. So I went up, Trump will get assassinated, and 18 hours later, my prophecy failed. But I was just going to say, I was digging back on, this one of the groups that's showing up after David Miller's group, and starting to get the usuals. You're getting Les, you're getting George Gonzalez. And I began to notice how disassociated from reality some of these people are, that they're up there with their grand ideas and their visions. And I mean, they're not applying these ideas to reality. We have all these, fantasies. And of course, when we contact reality, our fantasies fall to bits. And what I noticed with these characters is what Jordan Peterson was warning about, that, clean up your own backyard first before you try to order the world around. There seems to be legions of people today who figure that the whole world must dance to their tune. But essentially, it's the disassociation of reality. They're floating up with space with all these grand visions, like, the Mad King out of Baron von Munchausen. And they're not thinking, does this stuff actually work? I mean, it's crazy. Oh, you might believe in a political theory, Marxism, socialism, whatever. And somehow you got this strange idea that the whole of humanity, their only job is to be putty for your dreams. Now, the trouble is, the question is whether you can actually apply your ideals to your own life. But trying this, without even doing that, you're suddenly trying to figure, well, the entire mass of humanity with all their different types have to dance to my tune. And these people don't even question that attitude. It's absolutely amazing. I think this is part of the possession by the daemon. When you're floating up with all your grand ideas, and then you come down to earth and you try to bash reality with this particular thing, it's like a case of possession. That's why I wonder about the role of the personality. The personality seems to be a moderator of that spiritual force. Now, you've talked about spirit before, and Kenneth Smith's attitude to what the word spirit mean, I tend to disagree. I think the archetypes are an example of what spirit is, as versus, say, the soul. Our own self is more the soul, but getting possessed by a god is probably what I would term the spirits. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, these are you know these terms. These are these loaded terms that change their definition with every epoch. You know, so we can't simply answer a question like what does spirit means. It's like, well, what does it mean to an ancient? What does it mean to a medieval? What does it mean to a modern? You know, at a minimum, we have to cover that ground. And if there's other epochs from other continents and other times, of course, that we don't have well documented, presumably they have their own meanings of these things that are as central to their worldview as you know these three are to their three worldviews. It's a tricky problem. There's a, you know, I gotta quote William Fitzjames Oldham. Some people think they're thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. You know, there's the to what extent are we engaging in authentic thinking versus to what extent are we allowing our appetites or ideologies to calculate for us? You know, like if I follow the rules of valid logic, am I thinking or am I just mechanically moving a machine according to the mechanisms that it will allow me to do? And in which case, I'm not the one thinking, it is, right? Mine are just the fingers that are manipulating the gears, but you know, it only goes the way that it's willing to go. And it's, you know, part of what Kenneth Smith is getting at in these distinctions between the douloi, the monousoi, and aristoi is the douloi are rationalizing their desires and experiences. So they select whatever evidence helps them to justify what they already want. And then they forget about or ignore all the rest of the evidence that contradicts it because what they want is validation of their appetites. What the Banausoi want is validation of, you know, their systems of thinking and living. So if it's living according to a certain economic system, then, you know, they want the money to move the way the money's supposed to move according to that system. If they're thinking according to a system of laws, they want to illustrate that they have mastered those laws such that they're able to constrain their thinking to the blinkers of what the law allows them to conclude. Same for logic, same for math. Any systematized abstract thinking thinks for you. Your brain is just sort of, you know, the playground that the ideology is using to make its calculations. And so, you know, this concept is that to be an Aristos is to arrange one's impulses, either of those sets of impulses, either towards the dualic side of our lives or the Banausic side of our lives, into a dialectic so they critique each other, so that we don't trust either one of them to be the source of truth. And we compel ourselves to separate our identity from both of those halves of our mind, to allow ourselves to have an independent, free existence, and to consider possibilities that on one hand lie outside our desires and appetites and parochial experience, and on the other lie outside of systems of thought, to see what's real. Because what's real is not constrained by our ideologies or by our appetites. This is the thing that's hard for Homo sapiens. We want one or the other to be our God that gives us all the answers, when the truth is that both of them come from within us. Neither of them is reality. Reality is orthogonal to our logic, and it's orthogonal to our appetites. And it's up to us to harmonize with it, not the other way around. So your comment about the way that, you know, when are people thinking and what are they doing when they think, just, it really woke up that Oldham quote for me. It's like, to what extent is, or like Heraclitus said, to what extent are we just sleepwalking through life? We think that we're conscious because it pleases us to feel that way, but really we're reacting to a dream world instead of the world that we're actually in. GP, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Before I speak, I think James had his hand raised and he hasn't spoken yet. It'd be good for him to join the conversation.
Okay, sure. I'll call on James first and then you. Great
Oh,
idea.
thanks.
Thanks, GP.
Thanks, JP.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion. You're talking about the Greek myths. Are the Greek myths, they represent that culture at that time. And so, you know, they included the daemon, and daemon is how they interpreted the forces of nature and culture. So in our society, modern society, are we also subject to these certain myths that are, modernized and, they're derived from the recent history or less recent history, but they've been revised to fit our modern condition, right? And so with the self, the daemon or the underlying determinations of ourself be the culture that we're in and be the natural forces that we understand to be the representative of the daemon. So so we're all kind of like maybe looking for, we're like you say, we're on the stage where we're playing certain roles, but those roles are determined by these these various forces that are outside of us, within us, and so forth. So there's a famous play by Pirandello called Italian writer called Pirandello. He wrote a play called Six Characters in Search of an Author. So are we kind of like, playing roles? We're characters on the stage searching for the playwright who wrote the story, our story, and then we're trying to find, what our daemon is. I mean, or can we ever find it? And can we ever, ultimately find it? Or can you have this sort of like, take a leap of faith into some, some idea that you have about what that is? I mean, how do you know what that daemon is? But what you do know, what you could understand about yourself is in terms of the culture that you're in terms of the kind of world that we're in, the economic systems, social systems, and so forth, that we can understand ourselves in that way. And that's not just, within us, but also outside of us and surrounds us. So there's something to, what Heidegger, called the Dasein, right? Dasein is being there. So if we can be there, can we arrive at a true understanding of ourselves, in terms of our being in relation to, which is what you are in relation to your culture and your and all the systems that we're surrounded by.
Thank you, James. Yeah, this goes to the heart of kind of what the subject is, what is the nature of the human condition? And, the ancients had a particular model. The modern conception of the human condition is that there's no such thing as a soul, there's no such thing as the sacred, there's no such thing as gods. What there is a great meaningless collection of things. And if we choose to value some of them, we can exert our will to attempt to have those things and take them away from others and have them for ourselves. And that in the pursuit of those goals, our body is a machine and we need to feed it fuel, and our brain is a computer and we need to feed it facts. And if we do that, then we'll have a good life. It includes having to, follow the rules and not get in trouble with the law. And that's what it means to be human in the modern sense. And the ancients couldn't be further away from that. They didn't think any of this was a machine. They thought that we were organisms. And as organisms, we have within us an inner nature, a character, ethos, or a psyche, and that it wants things. It has tendencies to interpret the world a certain way and not some other way, and to notice some things and care about some things and not others. And that from that, it functions within us like a fountain of order, generating direction, sometimes contradictory direction. Sometimes our character gives us conflict, but regardless of whether it's harmonious or conflictual, if you will, it's still driving us. It's egging us on to reach out into the world and to act. And so all of the questions from the ancient perspective, that are related to what you're asking, James, they all come down to the question of what is the nature of that character within us? What happens when we attempt to act according to our character in a world that's sometimes harmonizes with what we're trying to do and sometimes conflicts with it, and so forth. And the Greeks have a whole framework that I'm sort of starting to get into today about how these relations work. And using their framework, they would argue that only some things are cultures, other things are anti-cultures, because they fill our appetite for culture, but they fill it with a saccharine ersatz replacement that doesn't nourish us. It's like the difference between to the Greeks, kind of what's at stake here is human survival and thriving. Are we drawn in the direction of what's good for us? Are we fascinated by the things that we need to pay attention to if we're to live a good, healthy, vital life? I watched, I don't know if you know filmmaker Carol Ballard. He made 6 films and 4 of them were nature films. The first one was The Black Stallion. The second one was Never Cry Wolf. The third one was Fly Away Home. And night before, it's 2 nights ago, Friday night, we just watched his 4th one. It was the second time I'd seen it. It's called Duma. And it's about a cheetah. It's about a boy who finds a cheetah cub on a road in South Africa. And they decide to raise it. And he has to come to grips with the fact that he wants the cheetah as a pet. But the cheetah is a wild thing. It's an organism. And no matter how much it loves him or enjoys its life with him, there is within its character a desire to go back to the wild. And one thinks of Jack London and Call of the Wild here, but this is kind of more focused on, it's actually a wild animal and not a dog per se. And that as the protagonist's father says in the film, that thing within Duma that wants to go back to the way of life of a cheetah is always within it. It's always calling and whispering. It notices the things that a cheetah would notice. It's fascinated by the things a cheetah would be fascinated by. And those things are designed to, by evolution, those things are designed to draw the individual cheetah into the way of life that's good for cheetahs. It's designed to help it mature its arites, its gifts that allow it to thrive, its desire to run, its desire to unite with the gazelle, to, its fascination with the gazelle, its desire to avoid the lions. It's got all these things within it that cause it to notice some parts of the world and take an interest in them, and to not notice and take an interest in other parts of the world. And that's baked into the cheetah. Even though the individual cheetah's life is full of choices and individual feelings and experiences, there's always this underlying matrix of character that's egging it on to grow in the direction of the mature adult cheetah that is able to live a healthy life within the African ecosystem. And the core argument of the Greeks is that virtue is called phronesis. It's the capacity to look at the world and see the parts that matter for your species and the way of life that you're supposed to be living. And built into it is the idea that there is a way of life that you're supposed to be living. And that if you look at all the animals, you can see that each of them has its way of life. Why in Fly Away Home does the Canada goose long to migrate when the days shorten and cool? It can't help but obsess about it. It notices the other geese flying by in the sky. It can't ignore them the way a person can, right? And it can't treat it as an aesthetic event. Oh, look at that V shape in the sky. The goose looks up and says, I have to do that. How come I'm not up there? I need to be flying too. That's its character. And it's different from the human character. So the Greek conception is the problem for Homo sapiens is that every other species of animal has a coherent entelechy, which is the fulfillment of its maturation process, that its character drives it in the direction of. As it grows up and matures, it wants more and more to do those things that are healthy for that species to do. Our problem is we don't have that, right? Our stupid pet trick in evolution was shedding so many instincts that it opened up a huge range of behaviors for us. Creativity, intelligence, there's all kinds of thinking outside the box things that Homo sapiens can do. But the flaw is we no longer have the compass, the phronesis that the other species have, that would allow us to know just like a compass should be pointing north so you never lose track of north, all the other animal species have that internal compass that's always pointing in the direction of their own species's, vitality and health an entelechy. Where are you supposed to be developing? Where are you supposed to be going? And we don't have that. We have the capacity for enthusiasms that feel as compelling as phronesis. But out of 1,000 such enthusiasms that different people might have, only one of them might actually, by coincidence, happen to be pointing in a healthy direction for our species. And the others are like, I think I should collect all of the Pokemon cards in the world and be the super Pokemon collector. And I'm as enthusiastic about that as the goose is to migrate or the cheetah is to chase the gazelle. But the difference is those things are good for the cheetah and the Canada goose, whereas collecting all the Pokemon cards in the world is not good for us. It's not that it's evil. It's just that that's not where our health or vitality lies. And we can't tell the difference. This is the human problem that the Greeks are worried about. Our species can't distinguish our artificial enthusiasms from whatever it is that we really need to be doing to thrive as a species. And so we're just as likely to destroy ourselves as to heal ourselves. You personally might have an appetite for helping other people or healing other people, but the very next guy sitting next to you might be thinking all the time about if only I could conquer the world, and he can't get it out of his head. It's every bit as compelling to him as your thing is to you, or the Pokemon collector is to him. And if you look at us as a species, you can't generalize from this what is the right thing for people to do. It's not clear at all. And we're the only species with this problem. So the entire framework that we're going to be talking about here over this week and the next few weeks is about this idea of sophrosune, which is the Greek concept of a human character that possesses phronesis. A human character that has the ability to tell, that has the internal compass to say which direction is vitality and health and living the good and beautiful life. Kalokagathos, as Aristotle put it. That we are not born with sophrosune. It has to be cultivated in us, or else we're never going to have it. And most of us never do get it. This is the Greek worry. And so this is how it kind of relates to what you're talking about, James. Is kind of, it's what's different about the ancient perspective on how we're supposed to live our life, as opposed to, say, the modern perspective, which is, do what you want, don't get in trouble. That's sort of the modern idea of what is the good life. You get what you want without getting in trouble.
So when did the Greeks lose that? Did you touch on that with the story about the conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans?
Well, Thucydides thinks they've lost it sometime before or during the first stages of the Peloponnesian War. Mm-hmm. He makes a lot of distinctions between Pericles as a leader versus the faction from the Piraeus, represented by Cleon, sorry, and the way that he shows that there's been a sea change in the character of Athens. He doesn't attempt to explain why it happened, but he does explain how the nature of the dysdaimonia, the bad character that Athens acquires, how it leads inevitably to tragedy through the steps of the Aeschylean progression. It's quite interesting. Yeah. And certainly you can say that by the time we get to Cicero writing during Roman times, Cicero can't even translate sophrosune. The Romans just don't have any concept like it. For all that we lump them together as part of the ancient world, they are absolutely missing the very most important ancient Greek concept. To such a sense that the most educated people working, the greatest translators working their hardest to try to authentically translate Aristotle, they can't do it. They just have no way to express it. And so he ends up defining sophrosune as temperance or self-restraint, which is miles away from knowing which direction is the way for a healthy life for people to live.
You think it was the overemphasis on rationality and the intellect?
That's part of it, yeah.
Okay.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
That shift from mythos culture to logos culture involves an overvaluing of rationality. And, sort of as the next 2,000 years of history have proven, people can commit horrible acts for rational reasons, just like they can for irrational ones.
Does Kenneth Smith talk about refer to Henry Bergson? Because Bergson is the only philosopher that comes to mind for me where he talks about this overuse of the intellect.
Yes.
And the importance of intuition, which is closer to the instinct.
Yes, he does some. He makes some references to Bergson, but it occurred to me there's another philosopher that Kenneth Smith talks about that I haven't actually mentioned, I don't think, in any of these seminars. I'm just going to paste it in here. It's Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote the book After Virtue, in which he argues that moderns don't have any virtues. We sort of have these empty ideals that we use as substitutes for virtues, but they don't move us the way that the virtues moved the ancient Greeks, or even the Romans had a concept of virtue. We don't have either one of those. And he explores, when did that develop? Why would that have been a problem? What have different philosophers said about it? It's actually quite an interesting book. It was one of the first books that Kenneth Smith ever recommended to me when I was first getting to know him a few decades ago. So you might want to check out the Wikipedia article. You might want to read the book. But he writes some about the things that you're talking about, including the sense that he has that nobody, but especially nobody starting with the Renaissance, but nobody has really understood Aristotle in the way that Aristotle meant. And the part that they've missed is not some detail, but the very core of his argument, which is this stuff about the problem with human nature being our lack of phronesis and the need for a culture that's very healthy to cultivate artificially within us the missing sophrosune that we need to live a decent life. And that then the sophrosune, if it's developed in us as a character, becomes sort of a fountain of the other virtues. We can have the other virtues if we have sophrosune. But if we just try to develop honesty in isolation for its own sake, or courage in isolation for its own sake, they end up being vices in us. This is all Aristotle's core argument. GP, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yep. Hey guys. So a lot of points were brought up in our talk. And okay. I guess just to go off of the I think the most recent point, Rick, I think it was about, you were saying there isn't like any innate sense of a compass within the modern human condition. And I wanted to say that that might be true at mass, like what we're like, I'm trying to get at is like intuition that can be a driving compass, and like there is, I think, a moral compass as well, of a conscience within the individual and the collective whole. And as well, like, even if we don't have structures for like what is good or bad, like there's still this innate essence of humanity that still has an appreciation for beauty. And like, you will see a butterfly as beautiful, but we'll see a cockroach as gross. And that's pretty like a given at a deep philosophical essence of the human condition. So like just with that base intuitive sense or awareness, and maybe like precognitive awareness, like a bird compass, combined with a conscious conscience. So like that just innate sense of good versus bad in a more generalized, getting into like an inner child kind of way of describing, like that there is some virtue that I think still remains. It's just not articulated and externalized in the most obvious of fashions, or the most storied or mythologized. Like in modernity comes the burden of a mundane existence, and so it's hard to even express virtuous ways of being when 95% of lifestyles are acceptable as long as you don't hurt others or hurt yourself, kind of in that huge brushstroke of morality in a modern globalized setting.
Mhm.
So I think there is still some intuition, and like in a more occult or deeper physiological sense, that bird compass can be, the third eye or the pineal gland, or that integration of electromagnetic centers of the body to then improve that intuitive magnetic appreciation for wavelengths or the magnetic interactions that might be polarizing or with affinity. Like, I think these forces of electromagnetism, without using words of spirit or of the spiritual, still affect all of us, whether we want to identify them as spirits or daemons or demons or jinns or magnetic waves, complexities that, are unseen forces in a real physical way of trying to pinpoint this soup of waveforms that create our shared reality. And I think there is an intuition at play in terms of how we, as just bodies with electromagnetism, can pick up on these waveforms. So going to zoom back into just the whole, yeah, I think there is still intuition at play. There is still a compass at play, whether we want to identify or not with it. And there are ways to cultivate that perception, that awareness of intuition itself, and to improve on the intuitive aspect of self. So I don't think we're a lost cause at all, actually. And I think the modern plight is just always trying to externalize and use empiricism to the point where if it's not perfectly boxed, then it's not worth interacting with or giving serious thought. And so, how do we tie this all the way back to the Greeks, and to the fall of the Greeks with the Peloponnesian Wars?
Yeah.
So, okay, Donald, his point was very materialist and very focused on the money and the power and the nuts and bolts of statecrafting and what might have happened to lead to the greats then succumbing to their own hubris. And you brought up a specific example of how Athenian military strategies got co-opted by their enemies and then used against them within just a generation or two later. So there was definitely a collapse in military hierarchy or military stratagems that were shared. And that coincides with what you mentioned, how the Greek intellectual, Cephalus or something like that, how there was a character change or spiritual change in the polity when Cleon came to power. And so what happened in what amounted to one ruler change and generational change within the spirit of the collective. And it sounds like there was whatever would have been a collective ethos or like a motivation out of love for the people got subsumed by a fear in a more individual sense for like being covetous towards money or small positional power within the polity superstructure. And like love for being Athenian and the love of being one with your fellow Athenian got subsumed by individualism and materialism in some aspect. And so what would that lead to? That would be like in very nuts and bolts terms, that would be like one of the petty officers, or I don't know what military hierarchy the roles are, but like a military strategist got too worked up in politics of his infantry versus in doing all of the unspoken and unwritten acts of information sharing, information gathering, and morale boosting that would have kept a certain squadron or flank of the military in more unity or more harmony with a grander love motivation, instead with Cleon and that sea change in the character of the people. It sounds like individualism and materialism made each of these critical hinge people within the superstructure of the society. They fell into their egos, into their shadows. And so if the mid-level military person isn't doing their darnest with utmost love for the collective, but is doing their minimal and instead ingratiating themselves on peacocking for position, or doing just the bare minimum because they're conserving energy and spiritual will towards petty puffery versus what's most needed for the collective during this many decades of warfare. I think that's I'm trying to take a materialist approach to the spiritual changes that were afoot, and I'm trying to then show how that spiritual aspect, or what could just be invisible electromagnetism, is there is a mechanism and there is a physiology to that. And so the bird compasses became less unified and more fearful and thus disintegrated over many years of less cyclical info sharing and taking care of your neighbor. So that was the disintegration over decades of warfare, and with a spiritual focus on what forces would have done so. And so then to Phil's point, Phil was talking about music and consciousness and how like once you get to a certain level of awareness, in that everything is just a waveform, everything is just vibration. Like, in fact, when you have those experiences of getting lost in the music, your consciousness is actually truly in the music in a very, like higher dimensional sense of that. And as to like being trapped in a cave, or like how is like your point to that whole like, okay, if you're stuck in the cave, maybe it's good to show the people like what they're missing out on so that they can walk out of the cave, where it's like I'm trying to get to like the point of like consciousness and how to know thyself at a deeper level to eventually leave the cave, when the cave isn't like the shadows of an actual physical cave. It's a metaphor for a sense of being stuck in the shadow of ego, in the creation of these boxes through projecting image, both of the self and of every other self, and pretending there's a false separation.
Yes.
And in doing so, sorry.
But part of what you're illustrating is the capacity that we have to take any situation and reinterpret it within our interpretive framework. It's one of the gifts that Homo sapiens has.
Projection, yes.
Yeah. So if we want to, we can read the ancient worldview as it's described, and then rewrite it to fit a modern physics-based worldview. It's all vibrations or electricity, or we can do that. And that ability to rewrite reality to fit our interpretive framework is certainly something that's very strong in our species. It's one of our gifts. So what Kenneth is trying to do is to show us how to stop doing that, to try to show us how not to rewrite reality to fit into our interpretive framework, but instead to look at the interpretive framework itself and start questioning it. Why do I keep using this interpretive framework? Is this the only interpretive framework I could have used? Are there different ways to look at the world? And do they have different strengths and weaknesses? So if everything is just electricity and waveforms, then there are certain kinds of things we're going to be able to understand well through that interpretation. But there's other things we won't understand well at all. We might make them fit, like pounding a square peg into a round hole. With enough force, it'll go. But now we've damaged the peg, and we're not seeing it for what it really is. This is a fundamental issue that he uses the metaphor from the Greek myth of Theseus. He calls it the bed of Procrustes. And he talks about how the villain Procrustes, he's supposed to be a good host to the people who are his guests, but instead every night what he does is he pounces on them when they're asleep in the bed that he set aside for them. And if they're too tall, he chops parts off of them until they fit the bed perfectly. And if they're too short, he stretches them like on a rack until they fit the bed perfectly. But in any case, Procrustes' goal is to change and warp reality to make it fit the bed of his preconceptions. And Kenneth Smith says this is what a worldview does to us, is it makes us look at what's actually happening and then rewrite it to fit what we're comfortable with as an interpretive framework. So the challenge for us is, can we learn interpretive frameworks different from ours well enough that we can start to see how, even though they might be worse than ours in some ways, they're better than ours in other ways. Each interpretive framework has its strengths and weaknesses. So what we're trying to get at with this ancient framework is we're not trying to critique whether daimons really exist. We're trying to critique, if you start with that framework, are you able to explain human behavior and history, including things that we as moderns don't explain very well at all? Are there things that framework can see that we can't see? Even if we don't believe in the framework, can it model for us parts of reality that we have trouble?
So I mean, yeah, that what you're basically boiling down to, can you interpret spirituality without belief in a spirit?
Yeah. Can we model, human behavior using this model of daimons and character in such a way that it can be useful to us, regardless of whether or not we actually believe that we're being possessed by little gods? And can that give us the ability to describe, for example, intuition in ways that an electromagnetic model of intuition might miss? So it's an interesting exercise, and it's kind of what the book is all about.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, there's a more dimension though. It just seems like it's projecting out. Can you speak of the spiritual without belief in a spirit? Can you? It's just, yeah. It's one of those things where I'm smiling like, can you? Like,
well, this is the experiment. So we try it and find out. We try it and see what happens. That's what the book's about. And a big part of it is, once we get past the surface of this model and get deeper into the way that they see the construction of character, do we start to notice things that they explain really well, that we like? Free will and determinism is one of those things that moderns have a very hard time explaining, but that the ancient worldview has a really easy time explaining. And they can explain the whole range, of human behaviors between free will and determinism with ease. Whereas all our arguments in the modern world come down to, it's either all deterministic, or it's all free will, or in some vague way, it's a compromise, or some of both. And that's about all we can imagine, because that's all the modern kind of reductionist approach to thinking allows us. So, there's interesting challenges here, but I'm gonna call on the other folks who are waiting in line too. This is the thing we'll come back to. We don't have to resolve it all today. We'll keep working on this week after week. So thanks for bringing it up, GP. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this came about, was on my mind. It came about from James's talk about sixth character in search of author. And when he said that, I immediately thought of a movie that I like very much. It's not my tippy top movies, but I like it very much. It's a Woody Allen movie called The Purple Rose of Cairo. I like that movie partly because it sort of talked around the movie. The movie became part of the content. But the secondary part of it that I like was that Woody Allen actually was empathetic enough for people living in an overly objectified world that somehow they can't get out of it, and that he was sort of like creating a sort of apology for an apology in the affirmative sense, was saying there's room and empathy for people who are trapped into something that they have to find escapism as an important part, and sort of like nostalgia as part of it. And that movie is about a woman, I think her name was Alice, but I'm not sure. But anyway, she lived a miserable life, had a husband that was exploiting her all the time, beats her in many instances, and takes her money and all that because he could gamble with it. And that her life is so miserable that all she does is go to the movies to get a touch of spirit, so to speak. And this day she went to the movie. It happened to be showing The Purple Rose of Cairo. Okay. And she went to it so many times that the character in there walked out of the screen and had a relationship with her, like she really, they became friends. And then there was one scene that was very interesting because he sort of fell in love with her, and she kind of likewise in a way. And she was in a prostitution house. The women called him, he's such a nice guy. They say, they sort of say, how about freebie? You're such a nice guy. And he says, no, my heart belongs to Alice. Thank you for your offer. You're such lovely ladies. If it wasn't for that, maybe, but so they loved him even more because this guy actually loves somebody. And then anyway, they got caught out, and the guy who was the actor to the movie finally appeared because there was so much trouble in the movie set because people were like, the guy walked out of the movie, and the characters in the movie just sort of sat around discussing like, what the hell's going on? What should we do now? That kind of thing. And so finally got to the producer, and then they sent this guy over they figure out who it was to see Alice. And then she was kind of a little messed up because there's the guy in the movie and there's a guy, the real guy. Okay. So he's talking to the guy in the movie, and she's talked about God, do you believe in, some greater power and other? So of course he only knows the movie. So he said, oh, you must be talking about the director. Right? She said, no. It's higher than that. He said, oh, then the producer. No, it's not that. And it's like, oh, the script writer. And so all they could do is objectify what the thing is, not God. So And finally, over a lot of, mix-ups, she finally decided, yeah, it's so lovely to be in this world with this guy because he's such a wonderful, wonderful guy. Loves her and all that. But she decided she needed reality. She sad day for her. So we went back, and her husband was treating her very badly, and then she ended up going back to the movies, right? Because she's trapped in a life in which there's nothing left, but in a sense, some sense of escapism. And so she was watching. I think the movie she went to was "Shall We Dance" with Fred Astaire, and so I think that was a kind of very wonderful, sympathetic movie about be a little bit sympathetic toward the people who fall into escapism because they have no choice. It's like they're not clever enough like you to understand that you need to penetrate beneath that. They're just stuck in that world, and escapism is all they have. So, yeah, it was a very empathetic movie in its own way. So, I thought I'd bring that up.
Thank you, Phil. I've only seen it once. I saw it in the theater in New York City, and I was very surprised. I had no idea what I was in for, and it delighted me. The actor and the character in the middle of the scene stopping and looking at Alice, going, I see you here over and over. And you're like, you do not expect a character in a movie to break rule, on the umpteenth, viewing. It was a clever idea. And I think your example of, his dialogue about, well, you must mean the director or the producer or the screenwriter, it really shows that issue of the Procrustean bed, right? He can only interpret God in terms of his own framework. And in so doing, he does the best job of mapping it he can, and it makes sense to him. It just isn't real. He's disconnected from, the larger reality that she's trying to allude to. And that's what it's like with these issues of human character. Is, the Greeks are trying to give us a conception of human character and why we do the things we do that's capable of expressing more of human behavior. In the modern world, we're perfectly happy to reduce human character to a computer that's programmable, and that, the idea is that you can make people do anything if you just give them the right inputs. This was
Well, we
behaviorism.
do live in an over objectified world,
Yes.
so it is easy for us to all fall into that situation.
Yes.
So we are at least partly like her, So that's
Yeah.
why.
Yeah, exactly. And you see it as well with, like, what is intuition? And to a modern, if we say, well, intuition is a little god, and that makes sense to an ancient, well, it's not going to make sense to a modern, because you're like, well, we don't, really believe in gods in the modern world. We have something like gods that some of us profess and others don't. But the ancient idea of a god is completely missing from the modern. So, someone who's trying to explain intuition that way is going to find the audience doesn't get it. But if they say instead, well, I think intuition is like an electromagnetic wave, and it's picked up by the pineal gland, and you start explaining things in terms of biology and physics, at least some of your audience is going to be receptive to that, because they're used to explanations in terms of particles and waves and organs that sense things. And, it makes sense to them as an interpretive framework. Even if they don't agree with it, they at least get the concept, and they can argue about it. But, if meanwhile an ancient Athenian walks into the room and says, no, I think it's a daimon, and, just like all the other daimons that are all around us and have authority over us, so does this one. And the audience is going to be like, I don't know what a daimon is. If I did know what one was, I don't think that they're everywhere and all around us. And if they were, I wouldn't think they had authority over us. Every part of the framework causes cognitive dissonance to a modern, because it's from a worldview that's alien to ours. It's incompatible, or as Kenneth Smith sometimes says, incompossible. They can't. Our view of the world and their view of the world can't both simultaneously be true from our own frameworks. Our frameworks rule them out. And faced with the prospect of having to do all the work to overhaul entire view of the world, we would much rather dismiss the other worldview. It sounds easier, right? So, rather than stretch our minds, we just say, you know what, that's just wrong and mine is right, and that's just how it is. This is how most people deal with conflicts between worldviews, or they take the option that medieval Christianity took, which is we will never have freedom and peace until we eliminate all these other religions. We need to have crusades and inquisitions. We need to clear the world, through genocide of every other form of religion, and only ours is allowed. And that way, once we all see the world the same way, I won't ever have to feel uncomfortable again because I talked to somebody with an alien worldview. So, what Kenneth is asking us to do in this book, it's uncomfortable and upsetting. It's easy to see, why we, keep would want to reinterpret it within a framework we're more comfortable with. Akshat, welcome to the call, and come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, everyone. Hello. Yeah, I guess there is this, I guess, analogous or analogy of the mythos to logos thing. I can think of it or visualize it as MP3 compression of music itself from analog, where like you take music and you compress it and you lost parts and bits of information in there in that process of compressing. But at the same time, you can also view it as cycles. You start with analog, you go to digital, and then you can say, okay, I have AI. I'm going to fill in the holes or blanks, and maybe it will come close to the original. And it's almost like going to that phi in and getting to it. And maybe it will be better, maybe it will be worse, but that's what phi is. You'll never truly reach phi. And then at the same time, there's this aspect of, yeah, we can go back to Greek culture or beyond that. You could say, okay, we can go to Egyptians or cultures before that we might have not heard of or known about. Maybe they were closer to technologies and or information that we don't have any clue about. At the same time, there's not an aspect of if things get lost, it's a bad thing, because as Lara Croft says, everything lost is meant to be found. um, and I think also in the words, I'm kind of touching all over the place, just points that brought up in the past by different people. There's this aspect of Pokemon cards, and yeah, for sure, like that might not be ideal. But at the same time, we have to say that okay, human beings are unique in terms of creatures, and we have the ability to have foresight to a certain extent, which is different than other animals. And in words of Abraham Hicks or Esther Hicks, it's an expansive universe. And basically, if you look at it that way, I mean, there are around 8 billion people. Um, so 1 in 8 billion can be correct, and that can correct the course of the rest of the 9.99, 7.99 can keep collecting Pokemon cards. Like in my case, I was collecting them. I had a Charizard first edition, and someone stole it from me in middle school. It would have probably been worth 50,000, I think. But yeah, sad. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Akshat. Yeah, I in a former life, I was associated with Wizards of the Coast, the game company, and my wife was their second employee. And so I cite the Pokemon card example because Wizards of the Coast did the Pokemon trading card game, and that was a big deal, right? And the whole reason we have a house is because there were enormous numbers of people who are really into Pokemon cards. If it weren't for that, we'd be living in an apartment or be homeless. So when I talk about the enthusiasm for Pokemon cards, I don't mean it in an insulting way. I mean it exactly the way that you were suggesting, which is that it is an interesting form of creativity on the part of evolution to develop a species from whom you strip out the instincts that keep us narrowly focused on what's the healthiest thing to do, and instead our capacity for enthusiasm, or another way to put it is the possible targets for our internal compass for what we think is the direction we ought to go. It can be varied. I mean, people can organize societies around all kinds of crazy things, and some of those crazy things might be better than what evolution would have had in mind for us if we had to evolve it the hard way. We can experiment more, but it comes with a responsibility, and this is what's core to the Greek idea: is that we really need to be paying attention to the consequences of our actions. How do we put together a culture? What kind of people result from that? What are other choices that we might make? These are all the things that the ancient Greeks were really worried about and wanted to think about. So in this book, you know, what we're seeing is these kind of this set of ideas that helps to unpack what Sophrosyne is. And I'm gonna take this opportunity to try to run us through some more. So today, so far, we've gone through daimon, this concept that, you know, that music may have a soul, a waterfall could have a soul, you know, a beautiful location might have a soul, fire has a soul, a specific fire has a soul, a person has a soul. You know, this is the ancient Greek idea. The pre-Olympian religion of the ancient Greeks was this idea of spirits everywhere. And that the part of the way that you know that there are spirits everywhere is that we are moved by them. You walk up to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and at first you're just seeing a parking lot and some buildings and some trees. And one more step, you turn the corner and your breath is taken away. You've never seen anything like it. I mean, a photograph doesn't come close to doing it justice. You're surrounded by the biggest thing you've ever seen in your life. It's just enormous. And it's ancient. And far off in the distance, there's a little eagle circling. And you're like, ah, my God, what am I feeling? And, you know, the Greeks would have said, you're feeling the daimon of the place. The spirit has moved you. You know, and it's the same if you're parched in the desert and you come across an oasis with clean water. You're moved in a deep and profound way. And that water has authority over you because you were going to die without it. So the Greeks, you know, this idea of what has authority over us, what do we need, what moves us, all of these things are daimones. Not to be confused at all with the later idea of demons. They're all daimones. And so what they're saying is our own character is also a daimon. And it also moves us. And it moves us according to its own nature. And so on the issue of free will versus determinism, they think, you know, if you just are subject to your daimon, but you don't understand it, and it just moves you through intuition and unconscious motivations, then you have no freedom. You're just an expression of your daimon and its, you know, directions. But if you study yourself and learn how your daimon works and learn kind of where does your daimon steer you right and where does your daimon steer you wrong, you gain the ability to be critical about your own character and to start thinking about how you might develop new habits that are healthier for you. You can change. The Greeks would say the way you express this is you can change your fate by cultivating your character. But you can only do that if you're paying attention, if you're on guard to the effect that the daimon has on you. So this is what Heraclitus means by ethos anthropoi daimon. And what Aeschylus is getting at with the concept of a daimon is not just the character you already have, but that other part of daimon, which is that your daimon can be possessed temporarily by other daimons. Like you take that last step and you see the Grand Canyon and you go, right? I mean, you weren't doing that a moment before. You know, and later after you leave, it'll have a subtler influence on you. You'll remember it fondly. You know, it'll be great. Maybe someday you'll go back. But you know, a few weeks later, you're caught up at your job and you're doing, you know, maybe you're programming, you know, or maybe you're in traffic and you're yelling at the guy next to you, and you're not possessed by the daimon of the Grand Canyon at that point. It's a temporary act of possession. This entheos, the possession by this sacred experience, or what a modern might call a peak experience, right? It's a powerful, moving thing. So I'm going to throw the other three terms out quick before I call on on Phil. These we went over these last week, but the Greeks had the concept of nosos, and a nosos is a disease, and it doesn't just mean a contagious disease, but it means, you know, an unwellness, something that's unhealthy, and that could include, you know, wanting to spend all my money on heroin and none of it on food. You know, that would be unwellness because I'm not living a life in balance or in harmony. I'm no longer pursuing my best interests. And they would consider that a nosos every bit as much as, you know, an outbreak of tuberculosis would be a nosos. So they recognized mental illnesses, physical illness, and characterological illnesses, right? And they use the same term for all of them. Because if you have the concept of phronesis, like the ancient Greeks did, if you have the concept of there is a beauty way or a harmony that leads us towards health, that's the optimal thing for our species, then you also have to have the other concept, and they do, which is whenever you miss the mark, whenever you're drawn away from that mark you should be aiming for, it's some kind of unwellness in you. It's a nosos. The fourth term that they have is a care, or the plural is caris. And a care is a daimon that brings nosos. They believed every illness, whether it's a physical illness like death or old age debilitation, whether you got crippled in battle, whether you caught a cold, or whether you just got greedy or depressed, all of these things are nosoi. And each of them is brought by its own care, which is a daimon that possesses you with that unfortunate situation, whether physical or mental or characterological. This is how they thought disease worked. This isn't the stuff you read about in Hamilton's mythology, but if you read some of the other things, like, Moirai, the book Moirai, or The Greeks and the Irrational is another great book on this subject, then you'll get to read about the use of talismans and little chants and formulas and little rituals, all the different things that the Greeks had that were designed to help them deal with the fact that human beings are constantly being afflicted by cares that are messing things up for us. It's like the Greeks sort of have this dialectical view of why things go wrong. And sometimes things go wrong because our character is bad, right? And we didn't have to be possessed by any other daimon. The daimon we were born with is already a problem, right? Like the monkey on your back, expression is alluding to this old idea of a bad writer. But they also recognize that you could have these temporary things that swept into your life and swept you away with them and messed things up that would have turned out right otherwise. And those were the cares, which were the external daimones. So you can see how this is different from the idea of a demon, right? In the medieval Catholic concept, a demon, takes over your choices for you. The great evil that it does is that you're no longer in charge. And that's the worst thing that could possibly happen if you're supposed to be oriented towards God. And once it takes you over, it can make you do things that don't orient you towards God in heaven. And therefore, as a result, you can go to hell. And it wasn't your fault, but what are you supposed to do? You need an exorcist to get rid of the demon. This concept is a completely medieval thing that has nothing to do with the ancient thing, except when we get to the medieval chapters, I'll talk about how it's related. But the ancient idea is the original idea. And that's just this idea that there are many things that move us in the world. And some of them move us, in good directions, some of them in bad directions. Most things move us in a combination. There's two sides to every sword. So some things about it are good and some things about it are bad. And that this is the fundamental structure of human life, is this intersection between the daimon that's in us and the daimons that temporarily possess us. And the last of the 5 terms before I start calling on people in line, which I talked about last time, is methexis. Methexis. And methexis is that you are not an innocent in being possessed. This is one of the ways it differs from the medieval concept of demonic possession. Daimonic possession is something that can only happen if you are open to it, right? And that in being open to it, you are participating in the possession. You're not merely a passive object being possessed. You are embracing the possession. You didn't have to go to the Grand Canyon, right? You didn't have to come to the fire in the forest in the dark and sit down and roast marshmallows. You participated in bringing it about. And one of the big ways that they talk about this possession is in terms of what are the limits and liabilities of your own character that make you vulnerable. So since I was born an alcoholic, even though I've never taken a drink, I am vulnerable to being possessed by the spirit of alcohol in a way that normal people are not. So I can't pick up the cup the way they can. Other people can do it and it's fine. I can't do it. It's a weakness in my character. And it's a structural weakness. As far as we know, it's genetic. So, that is my responsibility to manage. I have to know that about myself. It's nobody else's job to know that I have that weakness. It's my job to know that I have that. Gnothi Seauton, this is what it's talking about. You have to know your own character, or else you're not going to know when to be on guard and when not to be on guard. You're not going to know what to be on guard about, right? If you are constantly worried about being possessed by some care, but it's about some feature of your character that's really strong and it could never possess you, you're wasting your time, right? You're being a hypochondriac. You're worried about something that's not going to happen to you. But conversely, if there's a weakness in your character and you don't know about it and you're incredibly confident that it could never affect you, then you're just blundering into disaster. In fact, willfully blundering into disaster. You're charging in thinking that this is your area of strength when actually it's your area of weakness, and tragedy follows. Hi, Sharon. So yeah, when you see the Greek tragedies, one of the things you want to look for is what is the contribution of the protagonist to their situation? What is their part in the possession? What is the mathexis that they're bringing to the picture? And one of the big ones that Aeschylus talks about in the Agamemnon, which I mentioned last time, is this issue of phylaktos versus aphylaktos. Are you on guard? Do you know you have a weakness and you're watching for invasion on that point? Or are you unguarded, just blithely blundering into situations that you should have been cautious about it? The whole fools rush in where angels fear to tread, it's talking about this core Greek concept of your responsibility to be guarded and to pay attention to the things that you're not good at so that you don't screw up. Right? Like if you're not a good driver, you haven't learned very much yet, you should know better than to go get on a racetrack. You should know. You'd be out of your depth. You don't have to be a good driver, but you have to know that as a bad driver, there are certain situations you should avoid. And if you do that, then you have phylaktos, and it can help you avoid the worst cares that might descend upon you, the worst cares. But if you think I'm a good driver, I'm totally a good driver, I'm the best of all drivers, I can totally drive anywhere, and you go get on the Indiana one of the Indiana racetracks when you have no business being there, then you have created the tragedy. It didn't just happen to you; you made it happen through your foolish decisions. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, about the market is what I want to talk about. It's very curious that Athens fell apart because of Piraeus, and they focus on the markets. And it seems to me like in contemporary capitalism, it's become much more sophisticated. It seems to me capitalism is able to make these synthetic diamonds. I'll use that in the sense because it's driven into your psyche in terms of your desires. It's not about reason, it's about desires. And in some sense, by creating consumer goods that you actually want and desire, and through actually advertising all that, it sort of puts you in a state of making certain things fetish. I remember about a year ago, I saw a movie that was very interesting because you were talking about water. That was interesting. The guy crawling in the desert. And finally, he found water and oh, like joy and all that kind of stuff. I saw this commercial where this guy's crawling in the desert, as you said. He found a bunch of bottled water. He started drinking it. He spit it out. And then a helicopter came along and dropped off some flavor drink. And he's, oh yeah, that hits the spot. I mean, tell me that's not a synthetic diamond. Like, yeah, yeah, it's gotten to the point where we almost despise water in a way. We gotta have, I myself fall into that to a certain degree. The synthetic drinks, it's so appealing, we want it. It's like, yeah, they're very clever. I mean, they went beneath your thinking self to tap into this. No wonder we're trapped in this maze of things because there's all sorts of spectacles and advertising and all sorts of things that pin us in a way. So, yeah. So we develop synthetic structures. That's it. I think that's one of the reasons why capitalism is much stronger than other ideologies because it's able to adapt and penetrate on a deeper level rather than irrational. You should do this because it's good. No, it's going to get right down to what your desires are. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I mean, Kenneth Smith loves to talk about con artists and use that as a metaphor for the modern world. We think that we're free, and in a world that's all concerned with human rights and freedom, we're actually in a marketplace that has tried to take over every aspect of culture and convert it into a marketplace. So, religion's for sale, ethics are for sale, education's for sale, healthcare's for sale, sex is for sale, everything's for sale. But at the same time that it's all for sale, the people doing the selling don't want you to think of them as con artists. They want you to think of them as their very bestest buddies who only have your best interests at heart. They love you so much, and you should love them too. And they do everything they can to persuade you. You think that you're in a room full of friends. It's like that definition of democracy is 6 lions and a zebra voting on what to have for lunch. And imagine the surprise of the zebra when they find out how that vote goes. I thought you were my friends. We were always lions. We were just telling you we were zebras because it was the best way to get lunch. It's like this is the existential situation of a modern is thinking you're living in one world when you're actually living in a completely different world that's interested in exploiting you more than anything else that it's interested in. It's a critical thing. And you're right. It made basically what the previous epochs lacked was the industrial science of manipulation of desire and manipulation of understanding. They work on our desires. They also work on our ideologies. We read the newspaper and it gives us a picture of the world in which moderate, non-troublemakers are good people and extremists, boat rockers biting the hand that feeds them people are bad. And, this suggests that there's no possible reason to rock the boat, except unless you're bad. The only reason to rock the boat could be if you're bad. There's certainly nothing in the world that needs to change fundamentally. It's all fine the way it is. If you would just leave it alone, everything will be just fine. So we're constantly encouraged to be pacified and infantilized without ever quite realizing that that's what they're telling us to do. It's just through the use of words like insurgents, extremists. These nouns and adjectives, they work on us on an unconscious level, and they come out of think tanks. They're the result of teaching us how to pacify ourselves. Don't get in trouble. Don't rock the boat. Be moderate. Be calm. Don't be emotional. It doesn't matter how much you're being abused or how horrific life is treating you. If you get angry, it's your fault what happens next. You should never get angry, no matter what we do to you. Perfect. That's what a con artist wants. I want to pick your pockets and have you keep smiling. It's a crime for you to get angry when you catch me picking your pocket. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting on a couple different levels. That I was thinking about this idea of, kind of when you were talking about orientation, and essentially being able to even orient ourselves is actually an important thing to consider. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about just acting on our desires, is in a discussion about this where we were talking about the ideas of information, like what actually constitutes wisdom, and and what it constitutes knowledge, and these types of ideas. And there's a interesting example my friend has that where it maps on nicely to almost, if you look at it, to an organizational model, like the idea of your base desires, you're just reacting at an operational level. And then there's this kind of like management level where you're just, well, you understand from how things work, right? But it's not wisdom, right? It's knowledge, right? And then there's the governance system, which is our orientation, which is actually a really important thing to consider, because when we're talking about that, then that's our character, right? And that's where you have policies, like you come up with your own policy. I mean, obviously, and a set of principles that allow you to kind of filter that information. And when you have that, you don't necessarily need to put a number on everything. And that's where it's starting to, how you're filtering the information that's coming in is based on the fact that you're managing yourself towards a higher level ideal. Whereas, right, if you're at that base level, you're sick. Like, it's no longer you that's in control. You've kind of given up that autonomy. And so that you're at that operational level. And it's really there's no intention in it, there's no and then what happens is you start to try and figure things out by, well, putting a number on something or just consuming something. And you're just putting out fires, really, because there's really kind of no, well, there's no wisdom in your actions. So, I mean, it's interesting to kind of look at it from that perspective, in the sense that, yeah, when you're putting out fires and you're just going through life kind of drifting, it is kind of a mental disease in a way. And it's one by which, yeah, that can't be solved externally. So that's the other part, is that it has to be solved internal. And until, if you even try to solve it externally, no matter how that is, it'll create a cognitive dissonance that will ultimately manifest itself in some way. Whether, that be whatever, drinking, whatever, I don't care what it is, it could be anything. So that it's kind of coming to terms with that internal battle. And if you don't do that, then yeah, you're going to be ill in some way, shape, or form, because it'll lead into some kind of dissidence. And that's ultimately the, yeah, where you essentially haven't even considered your values, and you're like, oh my God, what's going wrong? So anyway, but the most important thing is obviously the managing of your character in that process. Because your character is like that one thing that, I mean, nobody's perfect, but if you protect it, that you'll feel like, there was something that you find purpose in that. And once you find purpose in things, that those base desires kind of dissipate. So anyway, and it kind of reconciles the cognitive.
Oh, those are great comments, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting model, regardless of whether we believe literally that little gods exist and possess us. The model gives them the ability to describe, a wide range of situations involving free will versus determinism, and kind of what are our responsibilities and what happens if we don't meet them, and what are the different ways to meet them or not meet them. And it's really interesting. I mean, it took psychology over a century to start to be able to explain addiction with any kind of coherency at all. And not just that, but cycles of abuse within families. It took forever to dig through that stuff, and we're still only really explaining it at sort of a baby level. We're sort of vaguely on the right page now, whereas for a long time we weren't. It's like, well, you lack moral strength, and maybe I should just hit you a lot and shame you and compel you to be a better person. That'll work. It's like, God, you can see the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War have this great argument where they're saying, when people are driven to do bad things through desperation, it doesn't matter what you threaten them with. Everybody knows it's useless to threaten somebody whose life is grinding poverty and say, well, if you do the wrong thing, I'll hurt you. He's already hurt. Right? You can't threaten him worse than his life is already. You may think it's worse to cut his hand off, but he hates his life already. And the hatred for the life he has is certain, Whereas the chance that you'll catch him and cut his hand off, that's a chance. It means at least he has a chance. So the Spartans are there saying, so you can't, you got to have a smarter way to deal with these things than just, if your battle hits you. But science wasn't able to rise to that level in understanding addiction until recently. And even now, the majority of people in pop culture still aren't willing to believe that, a good application of beatings or jail time or fines or something wouldn't make people shape up,
Yeah, I mean, in a way, people always, this is one of the things is that they're treating depression after they've gotten depressed, but they don't necessarily wonder why it happened in the first place.
Right. Right.
And so it's kind of like, well, if you had, I mean, and so sometimes, look, there are situations that, and there are, there's cultural issues that sometimes can cause that. There's a lot of circumstances that can cause neurological issues, so can be a chemical imbalance, all that stuff. I don't discount that. But there is a seemingly kind of like everybody's depressed. And it's like, well, this is, kind of what's this doesn't seem necessarily correct. Like, so the idea that then what ails me is a problem that people don't necessarily actively engage with, as you were saying just a moment ago. So if you're not actively engaging with the world, then you're not thinking about it intentionally. Yeah, you're going to be depressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, shocking. Like if you're just going aimlessly through the world, it's like, yeah, okay, believe me. Yeah, I can teach a class on it. Like it's, I mean, it happens. So, I mean, but I mean, that's part of it is that, when we don't necessarily consider these things, that it does lead to a dark place, no matter, and it may not even necessarily may not even be obvious to everyone else.
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't have to be this negative thing from like somebody that's hurting themselves in some way that's obvious to everybody. They may be hurting themselves in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I'm going to call on Stephen in a second, but let me just add a couple of terms that relate to that. And the first is your terms, right? Agency and contingency, which we were talking about even before you joined today. So we can't escape the framework you've given us, Joe. And here we find it, among the ancients. Cornford talks about the way that the ancient Greeks saw, that how things turn out is the result of this complex interaction between gnome, which he sort of translates as agency, and tuche, which is fortune or contingency, and that many of the most tragic outcomes happen when people get confused about how much of an outcome was caused by one versus the other, and then they try to make their next action based on that misunderstanding. So he says, the Athenians win this battle against the Spartans, and there's a great deal of luck. The Spartans were busy somewhere else. And, the Athenians caught them by surprise. But the Athenians don't like to think of themselves as dependent on luck at that point in the battle. So they decide that it's entirely their own cleverness that led them to win that. And there's a speech. They have a conversation with a Spartan general who's suing for terms. And he says, it's the simplest mistake in the world to make, to think that, a success was entirely due to your own agency. It's human nature to fall prey to that, but it's why we all know the wise thing to do when you have a victory is to be magnanimous in setting terms, because you don't really know how much of it was luck. And if you decide that it was all your strength and you aggressively pursue another great acquisition because you think it'll turn out the same way the second time that it did the first time, you're liable to be hugely disappointed when 2K turns on you. The Greeks really thought of 2K above all as not being stable. They saw 2K not as a good being. They saw 2K as the surpriser, the one who is constantly upending your expectations. And that 2K is every bit as bad when she makes things surprisingly good as she is when she makes things surprisingly bad. Surprisingly bad, it should be obvious why we don't like that. But surprisingly good, the problem is it causes you to overestimate your capabilities and then you overreach. that's the stuff we'll get into next time, is the anatomization of how it is that people convert a lucky success into hubris and elpis and eros. And, you know, the next thing you know, the Athenians are all sailing off to Syracuse and they'll never see their fleet again. Greatest fleet ever assembled by the Greeks. And it all goes down to waste because they misunderstood why they were winning against the Spartans. So there's a pair of terms I'm gonna chuck out there to go with this. It's called xun-tuchiai. And these are things that this is Tuke operating in her long-term guise, when she's good for a long time to you, or when she's bad for a long time to you. You end up either in penia, which is grinding poverty, where you've just learned to be passive and you're subject to all these horrible forces, and it doesn't matter how good you are or how smart you are or how hard you try, because fortune's against you. All of your efforts are going to fall apart. It does things to human character that are disastrous, and we'll get into those next time. But the same is true for Plautos. You end up with too much good fortune and you get really rich, and what happens is you deploy your resources not according to wisdom but according to your bad character. And your character is worsened by everything seeming to come easy. It inflates your sense of self so big that you start to think of yourself like a god. I could do anything. And of course, you don't understand you're just one bad turn of luck away from disaster at all times. This is what the Spartan general's talking about when he's negotiating with the Athenians. He's saying, you know, this is what you have to. You've had a great run of luck here. It was your skill, but you don't know how much of it was your skill. And you'd be best off trying not to find out, because usually you find out the hard way when you sail off to Syracuse and lose everything, which is what happens next after that in the war. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, well, whom gods destroy, first they grant them their wishes. I was just going to say, yeah, bringing up the idea about mental illness or neurosis, and it's a big question. It just seems to me that a lot of the psychiatric profession, who start off as medical doctors, treat the mind as if it's a physical body. So if we chop off a leg, for the rest of your life, you're going to be a one-legged man. But the mind is not like the material body. The mind is perhaps something where if your leg gets chopped off, you can regrow it. So I was just wondering, what do you think is, how would one, what's the main factor in neurosis or mental illness? And what's the main factor in overcoming it? That's my question.
Well, you know, I have a book I'm going to read on this. It's Greek Concepts of Psychology. How did the Greeks think the mind works? And boy, that's the second book on my list. I'm really excited to read that. I'll probably be reading it in August. And after that, I can answer your question. I say, what did the Greeks think was the cause of neurosis or these other things? I don't know right now, except clearly they would have characterized them as charis. They'd say it's a form of possession. You've been possessed by a thing, and it's a long-term possession. You know, if it's like an ongoing despair that you can't seem to shake, they would say, yeah, this thing has you. And what you're supposed to do about it, well, I mean, you know, ask me after I read the book, and we'll see. It's a great question. I mean, this stuff really goes to the heart of why they thought anything happened in the Greek world. And it's not just why did Thucydides think the Peloponnesian War happened, but really why did they think anything happened? It all is based on this model. And you know, it's a challenge for us when we read ancient Greek literature without knowing this background. We're not going to read any of the sentences correctly because we're trying to think about modern explanations, and they're really not. They're really thinking in these other terms. But if we know what their terms are, then we can start to see what they think is happening and why it's taking place the way that it is, and what they think right and wrong are in this situation. Even you know, basic ethics are hard to evaluate if we don't know what they think is happening as opposed to what we think is happening. So it's a great question, Stephen, but I hope to make myself competent to answer it given another month of reading, and we'll see how it goes. I guess Ginny's going to get the last word for today, so come off mute, Ginny. And oops, I accidentally muted you. Take yourself off mute and Tell us what's on your mind.
I thought I had just unmuted my, yeah, perfect. No, I'm just going back a few, like half an hour ago. I was thinking as you were talking about Shakespeare's plays, I took several Shakespeare courses in college and read most of the plays, but nobody examined it and critiqued it and dissected the way you did. And I'm thinking, if he was my professor, I would have gotten a lot more out of my Shakespeare, courses, Just wanted to compliment you again, Rick, as always, because you're amazing. As well as Greek plays and Greek, Greek psyche and all that. So I feel like I'm taking a college course when I'm in this meeting. So maybe I'm not the only one. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Ginny.
As
I'm
always.
still learning. I'm still learning, and I make my blunders in these calls. I'll tell you one of my blunders, by the way, for the record, before we say bye. Cleon and Creon are two different people, but I keep mixing them up. I know one of them.
Creon is Antigone.
Antigone, right?
Antigone.
And
Yeah,
and
I did that
Cleon-
play when I was in college. I did that play.
And Cleon's the guy from the Peloponnesian War, but I keep, I keep mixing them up, and I shouldn't do that because in my mind they're two different people, but I can't remember from one moment to the next which name goes with which. And so if you go back to the past recordings, you're going to catch me doing it wrong, and I'm sorry about that. The downside of having me for your college professor, I'm also a student. I'm still learning, and I'm still making mistakes right here in real time, recorded for posterity to mislead future generations. So
You're
thanks,
fabulous.
everybody.
Yeah.
I had a great time. I hope you did too. And I look forward to talking with you all next week.
And I don't know of any other meeting where we talk about, Pirandello's play, 6 Characters in Search of an Author, playwright, whatever author.
Yay.
I mean, just the thing that the items that come up for discussion is amazing in this meeting. So again, thank you.
You're welcome. It's how Kenneth writes. He's constantly bringing in these
Oh,
allusions and connections.
okay. So all righty.
I'm just trying to do justice to the way that he writes. Donald, you raised your hand. Did you have something you want to add here at the very end?
Well,
Oop, sorry, I muted you.
okay. I just want to, we don't need modern science to understand character and mind and stuff at a phenomenological level. We can know our own behaviors without having to understand neurology or something like that. So the Greeks aren't handicapped in understanding character and human nature because they lack biology or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And then it goes to the heart of what we were saying before. Each worldview has its strengths and weaknesses. They're weak on neurosurgery, and we're weak on character. It's like if I need someone to cut into my brain, I'd rather have a modern scientist do it. But if I'm trying to figure out why someone acted the way they do, I don't think a neurosurgeon is going to help me much unless it's a strictly physical neurological disease. Anyway, we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.